Welcome back, everyone. This is your host, the DN WhatIf, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Had the Quirk to Fall Forever? A special shout out to the original creator, Pixie Unicorn 1112. This is the permission statement by the author in written. Please make sure to show your support by checking out their work from the description. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Izuku Midoriya wasn't a coward. He was many things, but a coward was not one of them. Even when he was a blubbering, incoherent mess choking on every stuttered word and plea. When his small frame was trembling like an earthquake exploding along each cracked rib. When Izuku always found himself standing between perceived enemies and whatever pathetic charity case he deemed worthy of the inevitable bruises and spilled blood. It never mattered that they'd turn on him the first moment they were able and spat on all his pointless efforts. Even when he was beaten into the ground, body curled around itself to hide from the punches and kicks and quirks, he never knew how to give up and stay down. He was a useless crybaby chasing fruitless dreams far beyond his reach, but he was never a coward. So when Katsuki heard the news that Izuku Midoriya, Deku, that damned Deku, was dead, he didn't believe it. There were always so many whispers trailing in that nerd's shadow, the hushed, sickly sympathetic murmurs, the taunts clawing at his heels, the snickers and the harsh, grating laughter and the cruel jokes just within earshot. This time they were whispering about the roof of their middle school building. That Izuku had jumped. Just like the little 4-year-old version of him had jumped off the swings, bright red shoes blocking out the sun as he let go, as he tried to fly. He fell. He always fell, gravity stealing the flight out of imaginary wings and grounded the hopes that one day, maybe, he'd stop falling and begin something new. They said he fell that day too, and Katsuki was waiting for the punchline of their terrible joke. Waiting for someone to cackle and recount every tear Deku had cried as he stumbled away. Waiting for Deku himself to pop 6 feet out of his hiding place. Laughing, smiling, alive. Heartless pranks happened all the time. Misunderstandings happened all the time. So Katsuki waited for the punchline. But there was only a quiet funeral with a closed casket. Izuku's mother, Auntie Inko, was sobbing beside him, face buried in shaking hands, but the truth refused to settle home in between his ribs. It just lingered helplessly in the air like the scent of those stupid spider lilies their classmates left on his desk the whole week before the announcement. Deku was determined to achieve his dream, eyes stubbornly set on this impossible goal. Nothing could ever stop him when he got like that. So tell him how it was possible. How could anyone expect Katsuki to just accept that Izuku Midoriya would abandon everything at the teetering, rocky edge? Like his dreams were fleeting thoughts discarded like nothing, like trash instead of something he had spent his entire life sprinting breathlessly towards? He watched as Deku's body was lowered into the ground, heard the creaking of the pulleys like the rusted, clinking chains of that old swing at the playground. Handfuls of dirt, then shovels full were piled onto a silent coffin, but there still wasn't a punchline. Katsuki stood before the loose dirt. A harsh, dull gray gravestone etched with his childhood friend's name glimmered in the cool, autumn sunlight. There was nothing special about the grave compared to the others around it. It was just another chunk of carved stone hammered into the ground, etched with pretty words to comfort the living. It only happened to be newer than the rest of them, a bit shinier, not yet worn by time. It wouldn't last long though. Soon it would match all the others, and maybe one day, Katsuki wouldn't be able to recognize it, to pick it out of the crowd. They said that Izuku Midoriya was obviously depressed, that something was wrong with his mind. He was isolated from his peers, a loner, antisocial. They said he must have been fighting a long, treacherous battle all on his own, and in the end, he lost the war. Never daring to reach out for help. They said it probably started when he found out he was quirkless. It only ended when his skull shattered against the concrete. He wanted to end his pain the only way he was able to. The signs were obvious from the start. Bullshit. His quirklessness would never push Deku to commit suicide. He had lived with it for so long, had lived with the fact that there was nothing that could make him fly or breathe fire or move small objects. He was living with it. Nothing in this world could push him over the edge. But what if Izuku Midoriya wasn't a coward? He'd never kill himself. Not when he had a single mother waiting at home. Not when he still needed to complete his hero analysis for the future number 13 with the latest information of the debuting heroes, mind whirling with thousands of theories and eyes darting across blank pages. Not when he was so persistent and determined to accomplish his hopeless dream despite every single odds stacked against him. Not when the last thing Katsuki ever said to him was. Deku was too goddamn kind to pull a selfish stunt like that. A cold sort of numbness seemed to consume Katsuki as he gazed down at the remnants of his oldest friend, the one he had pushed and abandoned so long ago. It crushed his pride like fractured glass, leaving the broken shards on the ground surrounding him. The chilled air pierced his lungs as he breathed it in almost as if it was a silent reminder that Izuku Midoriya would never again be able to do the same. It didn't seem fair, but then again, things like these never were. Katsuki was the only one still around. His parents had left a while ago, taking an oddly quiet Inko Midoriya with them. Few others had attended the funeral. A handful of classmates with glistening eyes dripping with fake tears or quiet gossip. Pretenders for sympathy's sake only, for a free show. None of them actually knew who they were burying. A huffed breath escaped Katsuki's chapped lips, almost resembling a choked sob, but he'd never admit that aloud. "You damned Deku," he hissed beneath his breath, but there was a lack of malice lacing his tone. "You useless moron, why did you go do something so stupid? You left your mom alone, you know. Are you happy now with that decision? Did you really leave everyone behind? Did you really leave me behind, you worthless Deku?" There was no response. There never would be. Not from Izuku Midoriya. Tears spilled shamefully down his cheeks as the tightness in his chest crescendoed to an indecipherable cacophony of white noise. He was quietly glad that he was alone so no one would have to see such a pitiful sight from the infallible Katsuki Bakugo. He roughly shoved his hands in his pockets to conceal how they shook, but no one was around to witness the sight anyway. Without another unanswered plea from him, Katsuki turned on his heel, leaving the freshly planted gravestone and the remains of a boy who once jumped out of swings believing he was something more than he was. And despite having seen his childhood friend buried before his very eyes, despite hearing all the rumors and stories encircling him, Katsuki Bakugo was still waiting for that damned punchline. Izuku Midoriya was unsure of many things. Memories were fickle like that. He didn't remember much before the darkness took hold of him. He could only vaguely recall the sight of the skyline from a forbidden rooftop, sharp glimpses of the sun dipping lazily below the tall buildings and houses of his hometown painting the backs of his eyelids. It had drowned the world in ruby hues, like the world was on fire, burning. He wasn't supposed to be up there. The door was locked for a reason. Next, this distinct feeling of weightlessness, the pull of gravity taking over and tugging down. Just like those nightmares Izuku used to have, the ones where the clouds overhead grew smaller and smaller as the wind whipped violently at his clothes and his heart lodged its bloodied mass into his throat as the ground rose to meet his spine. He always woke before it broke. His dreams were kind like that. But this time he remembered falling, watching the sky bleed with dusk. Then something snapping. Then darkness. Complete, quietly endless darkness. He couldn't see, only hear. The screaming, the deafening, monstrous screaming that echoed through his pounding skull. High-pitched screeching that threatened to shatter his eardrums like porcelain platters. Not entirely human, not entirely animal, like nothing he'd ever heard before. Urgent whispers that crackled on his skin like bitter frost. The worst he'd ever felt. Like his bones were splintering into dust and piercing every organ, his blood congealing in their splattered arteries, rotting and curdling in his veins. Liquid fire, the last traces of the dusk sunlight, burned his skin, burrowing deeper and deeper and deeper. He couldn't remember it ever stopping. Everything hurt. The voices were hurting him. They wanted something, needed it. Revenge. Blood. Rage. They believed he could give it to them. They were angry. They wanted to kill. They wanted. He begged for someone to save him. He counted all the heroes he knew. He didn't care which one. No one came. Why did no one come? It hurt. It hurt. It hurt. Someone save him. It hurt. It hurt. It hurt. When Izuku reawakened, it was like he was in the space between seconds, unmoored, shifting. He was facing his broken mother. The afterimages and echoes vanished like turpentine splashed against a painted canvas, spilling from his mind. He wasn't entirely sure what he was doing beforehand or how he had found himself standing before his mother. The clutches of darkness still dug their sharpened claws into him, still tormented his mind, leaving his vision a splotchy mess of dripping crimson. One moment he was somewhere else. Now he was here. He'd had nightmares before, ones that left him breathless and choking in the middle of the night, but none were ever that vivid. Never had one made him want to tear the skin off his bones to relieve the pressure building beneath or had ripped minutes or hours from his tight grasp. The light outside the window was no longer burning. Instead, it had withered to mere ashes, dark and leaching. He couldn't recall the walk home or the sunlight slipping away, and now he was somehow standing in his apartment, uninjured apart from the tremble in his hands from the memories that didn't piece together properly. It must have just been a terrible dream. Maybe he got home and fell asleep on the couch. Maybe he couldn't remember because he had just woken up. Maybe he was disoriented, confused, not quite awake. Everything was fine. Yet, for some reason, no matter how much Izuku tried to convince himself, something in the back of his mind kept knocking down every deceptive delusion he tried to build with rotting wooden blocks. He fell. A harsh, choked noise that scraped viciously out of a shredded throat broke him out of his stupor. His gaze snapped up from the floor, landing on a hunched figure before him. His mother had never shied away from tears, but this was something different, something worse. Her once vibrant, cheerful green eyes were lifeless like the glass beads of a porcelain doll, encircled with red from an endless supply of tears. Dark bags smeared the skin beneath them in purplish bruises, revealing days, or maybe even weeks, of sleepless nights. She was paler than Izuku remembered, her freckles stark against her tear-stained cheeks. She was collapsed at the dining room table, enveloped in darkness, clutching a familiar family photo to her chest as though it was her only lifeline. She must have been crying over Dad again, he thought silently, a quiet pang spearing through his chest. It was not the first time he had awoken to her grieving over his father, but it was the first time that she did not try to hide it. Izuku's immediate response, despite the haze clinging to his mind, was to embrace his mother. "Mom, it's all right," he murmured softly, wrapping his arms around her heaving shoulders. But his body slipped through her like mist. He stumbled through his mother, barely able to right himself in time before he hit the floor. His mother offered no reaction. Whether it was because she was too distracted by her tears to notice or she was deliberately ignoring him, Izuku wasn't sure. What he did know, however, was that he hadn't been able to phase through her yesterday. Izuku turned back towards her, his gut clenching tightly. "Mom?" he whispered, his voice cracking beneath his breath. "I'm so sorry, Izuku," his mother croaked from between fits of painful sobs. She hugged the picture frame tighter, nearly fracturing the fragile wood in her desperate grip. Slowly, the knot in his stomach unraveled, relief oozing like sweet poison in his veins, but it was quickly replaced with a new sort of panic. The words she uttered were a clear echo of the ones she had said years ago, the ones that still haunted him when the night became too cruel and he passed the late hours counting bruises and burns. But at least his mother was talking to him. He must have been more out of it than he originally thought. He shook off the shivers creeping up his spine. "It's okay, Mom," he said gently, moving to stand by her side. This time around he didn't try to touch her, pretending it wasn't because he was too scared of the same result happening once again. Call him a coward, but he was terrified of what it meant. "You don't need to. What kind of mother am I? I failed you, Izuku." Izuku froze, the dread returning tenfold. "Mom, you didn't? What kind of mother doesn't notice when her son's in pain?" His breath locked in his throat, slowly strangling him. Alarms were blaring in his skull, warning him that something was terribly wrong, that he needed to leave. Something bad was going to happen, and he didn't think that he could fix what would be broken if he let this continue. Yet, Izuku wasn't sure what was wrong, nor was he sure why he felt his fear consuming him. Everyone knew that Izuku had always been a curious boy. No one ever taught him that curiosity killed the cat. "But I'm not in pain," he whispered, his hands trembling at his sides. The woman before him didn't acknowledge his words, she only sobbed harder, wiping her tears hopelessly with the back of her hands. Why wasn't she listening to him? What did he do wrong to make his mother worry senselessly about his well-being? "I'm fine, I swear." In a way, it was the honest truth. Izuku wasn't in any sort of pain because, well, he didn't feel much of anything now. There was only the constant strain of fear enveloping him in its bitter embrace, but he was always afraid. Fear was his lifelong companion. That refused to leave, even when he had nothing to be scared of. It was sort of strange. He felt almost empty, like something was missing, something vital. She dropped the photo haphazardly onto the dining room table, moving her hands to tug her hair, which had always been the same dark shade of green as her son's. "You could have talked to me," she gasped, pulling at the strands as though she could distract herself from the pain she was feeling inside with something physical. "I would have listened. If you come back, I'll listen properly." Normally, at this point, Izuku would have burst into tears alongside his mother, but nothing would come. He wanted to sob, to choke on that familiar, pulsing lump in his throat as his face burned with his cries. He wanted to throw his arms around his mother and wet her shoulder until they both calmed enough that nothing hurt as sharply anymore. Instead, a dull ache bloomed at his temples. He knew that he should be crying, that he should be in as much pain as his mother, but the emotions and tears never blossomed. If things were like how they were before that stupid dream, things would have been different. None of this would be happening. His eyes were hopelessly dry. Izuku was beginning to doubt whether the darkness was a nightmare or not. "What are you talking about?" he begged, collapsing bonelessly on the floor by his mother's feet. The headache only continued to get worse as the feeling of cold dread grew. "Mom, I'm right here. I didn't go anywhere. Why can't you see that?" The wind bit through his clothes as he stumbled across the school's roof. It blew against his black uniform as he neared the edge, overlooking the entire property. The sun was setting beneath the trees and tall buildings that surrounded the school, dyeing the sky a fiery red-orange. It was a cloudless day that bled into a cloudless evening. The memories were forcing their way to the surface despite his silent pleas for them to stop. He didn't want to remember. If he remembered, that meant... Izuku screamed, clutching his hands helplessly against his ears as if that would protect him from the pain, from the memories that he didn't want to recall. It was a childish attempt, he realized, but it was still an attempt even if it failed. The images still continued to flood his mind. The dam he had hastily constructed was bursting open at the seams. There was laughter. Izuku wasn't sure whether it was him or something else. He found it almost funny. The air was colder when you were falling. Falling. He fell for a small eternity. Then, suddenly, Izuku wasn't anymore. Because when his body hit the ground, there was a moment of pain, and then it all washed away in the darkness. He thought he would find comfort in the darkness, but it offered none. Just an endless hell of bitter screams and wails that pierced through his mind like tiny little knives. Izuku finally had the answers he so foolishly desired. Oh, he thought distantly, his wide-eyed gaze crashing to the ground. So it wasn't a dream. He was dead. The realization should have brought waves of disbelief and despair that towered over him, threatening to drown him beneath a tsunami of pain. It should have crushed him mercilessly into a dozen fractured pieces. It should have left him a broken, pitiful mess on the floor, sobbing until he choked on his despair. He was only 15 years old, and he was going to be buried 6 feet beneath the ground in a pretty, wooden box. Yet, the emotions he should have felt did not come. Instead, they seemed to drift away, abandoning his poor, broken body to the hollowness. Izuku was almost grateful for the emptiness seeping from his chest. It was far from normal and healthy, but he was silently glad that he didn't have to feel anything. The thought of being consumed by those emotions terrified him beyond belief. A joyless huff that barely passed for a laugh escaped his lips as he held his face in his scarred hands. They weren't scarred before he fell off the roof of his middle school. How long had passed since that incident? He wasn't sure, but judging by his mother's state, long enough that she was informed of his death. God, that was such a cruel word. Despite the permanent weight it seemed to carry, Izuku was still here, still here. Izuku chuckled darkly to himself, his laughter nearly drowned out by his mother's cries. She was alone now. Her husband was working overseas for an indefinite amount of time, and he didn't even bother to call anymore. Izuku doubted he would start now after years of radio silence. So no husband, no son, no support system to help her through her son's unexpected death. Suicide, his mind whispered, the pieces finally coming together as a narrative that explained the evidence left behind. She was blaming herself for not noticing his pain before it was too late. Yes, Izuku had been in pain every day he went through those stupid doors. He was quirkless in a world where the extraordinary was ordinary, and he was an anomaly. He was a dying breed, the annoying filth beneath everybody's shoes, a statistical wonder in all the worst ways. It was only natural that he would be cast out. But he never wanted his mother to know what he had to go through. She never did. Izuku had hid it so well from her, it was practically his life's work, and now she was sitting in their dining room crying over an ancient photo of a family that hadn't been whole long before tonight. It wasn't fair. The hollowness was filled with a cold rage, seeping and bitter. It wasn't something he was accustomed to, never one for anger when it was pointless against people so much stronger and better than him. But at least he was feeling something. The glass of the picture frame made a quiet noise as it cracked. It was strange, knowing that it was his body being put into the ground at a funeral. An eerie sort of chill seemed to encompass his entire being as the coffin. His coffin was gently, almost lovingly, lowered into the brown dirt, still slightly damp from last night's rain. It was a silent affair, save for the quiet creaking of the ropes of the pulley system. Whatever tears Izuku's mother had left within her had dried up within the last few days. Now, she was heartbreakingly mute, which Izuku found was worse. Izuku had never once wished for someone to be screaming at him more than he did at that moment. At least then, they'd acknowledge his lonely existence. There was nothing special about his coffin. It was just a smooth, wooden box that would hold his remains for the rest of eternity, or until the earth was destroyed. Or if someone went grave robbing and stole his bones or the coffin itself. Izuku wasn't exactly well versed in the world of grave robbers, so he didn't know what they wanted. Though he doubted he would be a target. He was no one significant, just a quirkless hero wannabe that died before his dream did. There was nothing special about his gravestone either. The only unique thing about it was that it was Izuku's name carved into the stone in a fancy print and that the dirt in front of his marker was freshly dug up. He was a newbie, but soon enough, the shine would fade from the stone, and grass would grow over the dirt. It would blend in with every other gravestone around it, and he'd be forgotten amongst the other dead. There were only a handful of people that would bother remembering such a pathetic soul like himself. And once they were gone, he'd disappear completely from the world. Once his body was left to decay beneath the dirt, the few people that attended his quiet funeral trickled out from the graveyard. Auntie Mitsuki and Uncle Masaru ushered his mother away, probably to distract her with happier things or to comfort their grieving friend. Either way, Izuku was thankful that they would even attempt to console her. Kaken lingered a little while longer by his grave. He was angry. Kaken was always angry nowadays. They used to be closer once upon a time before quirks were more important than silly friendships. Before their childish dream of Kaken enlisting Izuku as his sidekick was crushed beneath fate's cruel foot. Before Izuku learned he was quirkless and Kaken's pride got in the way. They had bonded over heroes and quirks when they were little, before the age of 4. Izuku had always deeply admired Katsuki Bakugo. He was strong, even when his explosive quirk hadn't even manifested yet, and he always seemed so confident. Kaken was everything that he could never be, but Izuku still followed him around in hope that one day, he'd be able to walk beside him as an equal. When Kaken's quirk appeared, pride began to take root within the young boy. Everyone always complimented his power, always said that he'd make the perfect hero. His quirk was flashy and strong, and Kaken had both the determination and will to back it up. Katsuki Bakugo's quirk was useful. Something that Izuku Midoriya would never be. Izuku was a smart kid. He was the first to notice the gap growing between him and Kaken as more time passed. Everyone else in his class possessed a quirk. Everyone had something, whether it be ultimately useless or held unlimited potential, at least they had something. Izuku was the freak. He was powerless. He had nothing. In Kaken's eyes, that meant that Izuku was broken, worse than useless. Izuku wasn't bothered by the nickname he received from his oldest friend, even if Deku was meant to be cruel, to rub salt in a fresh wound. At least it still connected the two boys with the great divide growing between them. It hurt at first, but eventually one grows used to cruelty. Especially when cruelty was all you ever received from others. By the time they reached middle school, their friendship had diminished into little more than dust and was left to be forgotten in the backs of their minds. Kaken was constantly surrounded by their peers. He was popular, glowing in the spotlight of strength and limitless potential. He was meant for something greater, something bigger and better than some stupid middle school full of nobodies. Izuku knew that there was probably no hope in wishing to reunite with Kaken as friends like they were long, long ago. There certainly wasn't any now that he was dead. It surprised Izuku that Kaken even bothered to stay, even after everyone else left. He still wasn't entirely sure if it was a pleasant surprise or not. He was still deciding. Still, Izuku stood by his old friend's side as Kaken glared down at the stone as though he could blow the rock to pieces with a single look. If anyone could do it, it would probably be Kaken, even if he didn't use his quirk. Of course, the first thing out of Kaken's mouth would be curses aimed his way. Kaken always found a way to hit where it hurt without the least bit of effort. Perhaps it was because he was brutally honest. He had always hated liars, even when they were younger. Izuku was only half paying attention to the words falling from his childhood friend's lips until he got to the end of his little tirade. Did you really leave everyone behind? Did you really leave me behind, you worthless Deku? Izuku couldn't remember the last time he saw Kaken cry, if there even was a last time, but now, tears were streaming down his face in silent rivers. His pride had been chipped away, leaving behind a boy who had lost someone he had known his entire life. Someone he grew up with, someone he had once promised to work alongside when they both became wonderful heroes that the world could depend on. It didn't matter if there had been a ravine between the two of them. A loss was still a loss. And Kaken hated losing more than anything. Izuku wanted nothing more than to wrap his arms around his friend once more, but he didn't want to be reminded that he could no longer touch anyone. He wanted to comfort him with gentle words, but Kaken could no longer hear him. In the back of his mind, Izuku wondered if Kaken would be glad that he didn't have to listen to his annoying muttering anymore. "Sorry, Kaken," he murmured, despite knowing full well that his apology fell on deaf ears. "I know you don't like it when anyone runs ahead of you, but I think it's all right if I beat you in this particular race, don't you think?" Kaken didn't answer, but that was to be expected. Why say anything else when you couldn't hear the reply? Soon after, too soon for Izuku's taste, Kaken left him alone in front of his grave, never bothering to look back to see that his childhood friend was still there, still waiting. Izuku Midoriya was dead after all. Katsuki was still alive and breathing like the rest of the world. Izuku would be surrounded by dozens of people, but he'd be alone for the rest of eternity, unable to communicate or touch anyone ever again. He wasn't sure how long he'd be stuck here for, or if this was the fate of all those who died the way he did, but he just hoped that he wouldn't have to be like this for too long. He had always hated loneliness. Kaken, on the other hand, had always been the center of attention. Everyone would surround him like thousands of moths to a light, but only a few of them would ever be genuine in their approach. Most of them would want to befriend him for his power, for his strength, and only a handful would ever look his way seeking actual friendship. Izuku prayed that Kaken would be able to seek those few people out of the giant circle that encompassed him. He watched Kaken's back as he retreated back to the exit of the cemetery, once again leaving him behind. He was almost glad to see that some things never changed. He was still watching Kaken's back as he moved on with his life while Izuku was forced to remain stagnant. In some ways, he supposed that he had already beat his friend, though. Perhaps this would be the only thing he'd ever accomplish before Katsuki Bakugo. Izuku couldn't decide whether that was a good or bad thing as he gently waved goodbye. "See you at the finish line, Kaken?" Izuku was quick to learn that humans didn't realize the value of what they had until it was ripped away from them. Sometimes, It required a rather violent wake-up call for one to realize that what they held in their hands in their everyday life was precious. They took it for granted, often forgetting its existence by pushing it into some far corner of their mind. They didn't see its value because it occurred every day. It was like the sun rising. It appeared every single morning without fail, just like it set come evening. No one needed to worry that the sun wouldn't rise the next day or that a cold darkness would envelop the world. But everyone seemed to forget that precious things were the first to be stolen. Izuku had taken things for granted too, things he didn't believe were important until they slipped through his fingers like grains of sand. He didn't think he'd miss, or even notice, his lack of a heartbeat, but he did. He felt like a small piece of him was missing, constantly reminding him of what he had lost. It took him a few days to realize that it was because the too familiar thrum of life that had once coursed through his veins had come to a freezing halt. His body felt eerily still in a way that Izuku never thought he'd get used to. It took him about a week. It reminded him of when he used to get sick for days at a time, and he'd forget what it was like to be healthy again. He'd grown accustomed to not being able to breathe through his nose and the scratchiness of his throat. What it was like before was a faded memory. It was a little like that now. The only difference was that he would never become healthy again. This, the unnatural stillness, the emptiness, was his new, permanent normal. Forgetting what being alive felt like didn't scare him as much as he knew it should have. That was another thing he took for granted when he was still breathing. Emotions. It wasn't that he couldn't feel them now, or that they had magically dissipated into the wind. They were still very much there. They just weren't as prominent as before. It was like someone had put a damper on his temporal lobe, making it more difficult to allow those feelings to come forth. While he still felt emotions, fear, joy, sadness, anger, it took more effort than before to express them properly. They just weren't as loud or prevalent anymore. Izuku knew that he was overly emotional when he was alive. He couldn't even begin to count the number of times he was called a crybaby at school. He took after his mother, he knew, so those insults only stung a little bit. His mother was emotionally invested in everything, and she had taught her son to be the same. Whatever he felt, it was clearly written on his face. Izuku was never any good at hiding things like that, at least, from everyone except his mother. Now, to have gone from feeling each and every ping on the map to the bare minimum left Izuku unsteady, like he was on a ship that kept rocking with each crashing wave. If he had been alive, he knew he would have spent the last few months bursting into a stream of endless tears, enough to flood the entire city 5 times over. Yet, even if he wanted to, Izuku didn't think he had enough energy to scrounge up the emotions to cry. Izuku sighed, leaning more of his weight against the railing, though it was more like he was floating above the bars since he couldn't actually touch the metal, as a cold breeze brushed past his skin. At least, he assumed the wind would have been cold had he actually been able to feel it. It tousled everyone else's clothes with a violent ferocity that forced them to wrap their coats tighter around their shivering bodies. They walked briskly around him, sometimes even through him, to quickly get to the comforting warmth of their homes. Red noses and tips of ears passed in a flurry like the gentle snowflakes that cascaded from the sky. A thin blanket of snow had already been draped across the ground, and it was only getting thicker as time passed. Izuku was silently glad that he wasn't able to feel the cold, but it felt strange to see everyone else freezing while he didn't even feel the faintest chill against his skin. It was growing late, the sun setting over the overpass from where he had been watching for hours, maybe even days. He had lost count sometime between the first villain attack and seeing a group of UA students cheerfully walking home after school. The days seemed to pass faster now that he was dead. Sometimes, he'd be staring off into space, and suddenly hours had gone by without warning. Somehow, it had already been 4 months since his funeral, and Izuku could barely comprehend that small fact. For the past 4 months, the will to pay attention to what was going on around him slipped through his fingers just like everything else. The people who walked by, the villains that ravaged the city at random intervals, they suddenly seemed to matter very little to him. There was a bitter feeling clenching around his heart every time he witnessed the world moving on while he was hopelessly stuck, but the world had to continue even after he was gone. It wouldn't stop just for his sake. Izuku still cheered every time a hero won a fight against a villain or when a new one debuted, but he had stopped analyzing them and their quirks. There was no point in writing in his hero analysis for the future notebook if he had no future. It wasn't like he could write in it anyway. He couldn't even pick up a pencil. It would just slip right through his fingers. But just because he didn't have a future didn't mean the rest of the world didn't. He would still silently cheer the heroes on, even if no one could hear him. Izuku sighed breathlessly once more, pushing away from the edge, only to climb on top of the railing. It was almost a recreation of what occurred 4 months ago, an entirely different location but a similar action nonetheless. Below him was a busy road, bustling with life and noise. No one stopped him as he fell this time either. No one saved him. He couldn't die twice, after all. 3 more months passed, and Izuku had avoided his apartment like the plague. If he had to be completely honest with himself, he would say it was because he was terrified of watching his mother wither away in front of him. He had spent the first 4 months of his death constantly watching over her shoulder, even if he couldn't do anything other than be a witness to her numerous breakdowns. He thought that maybe, just maybe, she would be able to feel his presence, and he could act as some sort of comfort to her. In the end, Izuku came to the conclusion that he was powerless to do anything other than sit around like some useless guardian angel. Kaken was right. He really was useless, wasn't he? He had hoped that if he had left, maybe then she'd be able to move on like the rest of the world. It hurt to think that, to want that, but he needed to do what was best for his mom. Even if that meant that she would have to let go of her son and slowly forget about him. It hurt more to see her so broken and alone. She was like a ghost of her former, cheerful self. Izuku was the one that was supposed to have died. So why did his mother look like her heart had stopped alongside his? That was the worst part about his whole situation, he decided. It wasn't that he was going to be alone forever, unable to touch or communicate with anyone else again. It wasn't that his 16th birthday was coming, but nothing would change even if 100 more birthdays passed. He'd still look 15. God, it wasn't even the fact that his face had been plastered all over the local news, mourning after sad life lost to their own hand, just another statistic to add to a narrative no one cared about. The worst part about dying was watching how those who knew him reacted. His mother's heart-wrenching cries would forever remain engraved into his skull, reverberating on a never-ending loop. The image of Kaken cursing his name while tears streamed down his cheeks would haunt him for a small eternity. Because Izuku had an eternity, a literal forever left ahead of him. Izuku hadn't bothered to check to see how Kaken was doing since his funeral. He was almost more terrified to see how he was coping compared to his mother. Kaken always had an explosive and prideful personality, and he hated losing anything, even if it was something as trivial as Izuku. And he was a trivial matter to Kaken. They had drifted apart over the last few years. Kaken had probably reverted back to normal a few days after his funeral. Besides, Izuku had already heard that Kaken had been accepted into UA, the top school for heroes in training. Katsuki Bakugo was going to do amazing things when he became a hero. Katsuki Bakugo would become the #1 hero, with or without him around. Kaken would be fine on his own. Izuku was positive. Izuku, on the other hand, that would soon be determined. Currently, he stood outside of his old apartment, a quiet, spring breeze whistling through the empty streets. It had been months since he last saw his mother, and he had decided it was time to see how she was handling things. It had taken a little longer than he expected to work up the courage to come back home. It may have had something to do with how differently time seemed to move for him, but he had no plans to leave again. Not until she seemed content with her new life without her son. But when Izuku returned home, he knew something was wrong even before he entered his apartment. No lights were on through the windows, casting the entire apartment in darkness. It was only around 8 o'clock at night. His mother was usually still up by now, unless she changed her schedule while he was away. He tried to convince himself that that was the case, but there was no reason he could come up with that explained why the building seemed to be drenched in a thick layer of loneliness. A cold wave seemed to permeate from the doorway. It was the first time he'd felt cold in 7 months. Izuku phased through the door, a growing pit of dread eating away at his stomach. Darkness. It was cold. It was lonely. It was empty. Izuku rushed down the entryway, and if he had a pulse, he was sure it would have been pounding in his ears. She was probably just sleeping early. The last few months had to have been stressful and tiring. If not, she might have been in the living room watching TV, or she might have changed shifts at work and was working nights now. Anything was possible. He hooked a left towards his mother's room and poked his head inside. Inside was empty, and it wasn't just because Inko Midoriya wasn't there. The sheets from her bed were stripped off, leaving only the bare mattress and the frame. Izuku remembered the photos that lined the end table at his mother's bedside, ones that included his father and a younger, and very much alive, version of himself. They were missing, nowhere to be seen on the table or around the room. The closet doors were open, revealing an empty space, free of his mother's familiar clothing. Oh no. Izuku shot out from the bedroom, practically jumping through the doorway to see the living room. Gone. Every trace that someone had been living here, all the photos, the decorations, Inko Midoriya's personal touches, were gone. They had vanished, leaving the apartment bitterly empty and lonely. There was nothing. This place had been abandoned, Izuku along with it. He didn't know where his mother was. He couldn't ask. He couldn't find her. He was alone. His only blood was gone. Gone. What was he supposed to do now? Dread crawled up his throat, slowly strangling him, but he didn't need to breathe. Panic flickered through his body, his skin and clothes fading in and out as he clutched his curls tightly in his scarred fists. He felt like he was suffocating, but it didn't make sense. He didn't need air. He didn't need to breathe. He was dead. So why did it feel like he was being smothered? He fell to his knees, his chest heaving violently. His vision was dyed red as blood dripped from his forehead, running in a steady stream down the side of his face. The scars on his hands ripped back open and more blood cascaded down his arms in scarlet streams. Come back. I promise never to leave again. Please, don't leave me alone. I don't want to be alone. Was this how his mother felt back then? All those months ago when she was crying over that old photo, begging him to return home to her? Did it hurt this much? What she must have felt had to have been so much worse. If he felt like his heart was going to explode while his emotions were weakened, his mother must have been dying. Is that why she left? To get away from the memories? Memories were painful. Memories didn't go away just because you wanted them to. Oh no. Izuku sat back, his bloodied hands slowly falling from his head. That's right. Izuku Midoriya died 7 months ago. He was a ghost now. His emotions were fading, becoming harder to find. So if he just buried them, he'd forget about them. They wouldn't hurt him anymore. If he didn't feel anything, he wouldn't have to be in pain. Being alone wouldn't hurt. Izuku shoved down the pain, the loneliness, everything. He wasn't sure where, but it didn't matter. He didn't want to feel those things. If he never found them again, he'd be grateful. So he locked them away, stuffed them deep into the far reaches of his ribs, some pocket of shadow that resembled the rest, and he threw away the key. He didn't leave a gravestone or some marker of where he buried them. He didn't want to find them again. He didn't stop until he felt just as empty as the rest of the house. It didn't matter if it was only a temporary fix. Izuku Midoriya finally got what he wanted. His mother had moved on to a place where he couldn't follow, but she took the first step herself. Everyone was slowly leaving Izuku Midoriya behind. It's okay. He'd just wait for her to find him. Izuku Midoriya was a very patient boy. The first time that Shudo Todoroki noticed the boy was sometime during early May. The boy was leaning against the railing of an overpass, one that Shudo had to cross every day in order to get to school from the station. At first, he thought it was some sort of weird bush hovering in the corner of his vision, but when he turned, it was a head of forest green curls that belonged to a boy probably around Shudo's age. Although it was originally his hair that caught his attention, what kept it was the dark, contemplative glimmer in his matching green eyes as he gazed unblinkingly at the traffic below. The boy seemed to be around 15, maybe younger judging from the childish roundness of his freckled cheeks, but Shudo couldn't be entirely sure. For all he knew, the boy could have been a few years older than him. That sort of glint in his eyes wasn't something that many young teenagers possessed. It was reserved for someone older, someone who'd lived enough life to become haunted. Perhaps that was why Shudo managed to pick him out of the small crowd when school finished, and he, once again, had to cross the overpass to get to the station. It had been several hours since he last saw the boy, but he didn't seem to have moved even an inch since that morning. Shoto threw a glance at him as he passed, but the boy in question didn't seem to notice that someone was watching him. Either his awareness was awful, or he simply didn't care. Shoto wasn't too sure which one it was. Throughout the next few weeks, the boy kept popping up at strange increments. Sometimes, he'd be there for multiple days on end only to be suddenly missing one morning. Or he might appear in the morning, but then he'd disappear come time for Shoto to return home. There was one week in particular where the boy didn't appear at all, neither in the morning or the afternoon. On the Monday after that week, the green-haired boy returned to his spot after school, seeming more exhausted than usual, but that contemplative glint was still burning in his eyes. Shoto was a little later than usual getting to the station since he had cleaning duty that day, but he didn't mind too much. He was only bothered because Mineta was assigned to the same task as well, which meant that Shoto had to do most of the work while the little grape gawked out the window at every passing female in sight. But at least the work was done correctly and without fail. By the time he arrived at the overpass, it was completely free of people, excluding the green-haired boy. It had been the first time in a week since Shoto last saw him amongst the usual, small crowd of people that traveled across it. He was leaning against the railing, gazing down at the passing cars beneath him as though he was silently calculating his chances of survival if he were to fall. Shoto didn't have to be an expert to know that his chances were probably zero unless the boy had some sort of quirk that would increase those odds, but even then, it was illegal to use quirks in public areas. It seemed like the boy arrived at the same conclusion, but it didn't stop him from resting against the rickety bars. His bright green eyes were dull with boredom and exhaustion as though he had been waiting for something or someone, but it had been hours without any sign of them. Shoto froze on the top of the stairs, watching as the sun dyed the boy's sickly pale skin a warmer tone. Night was coming, stealing all traces of sunlight with it, as well as the crowds of restless citizens. They were the only two people in sight, minus the ones driving below them. You probably shouldn't be leaning against the railing. You could fall, Shoto stated flatly, watching as the boy leaned a little farther over the edge. It isn't exactly stable. He wasn't sure why the words spilled, unchecked, from his lips. Shoto didn't even know him, and here he was lecturing him. The boy must have thought that he was insane, randomly criticizing strangers. However, the response he received wasn't the one he was expecting. He didn't glare at Shoto like he thought he would. Instead, his head slowly tilted towards him as though he was entrapped in some mind-numbing haze that diluted his reaction speed. As their eyes met, the boy's widened a fraction like he was absolutely terrified that some random stranger had suddenly called him out. It was quite a large change compared to his usual, dull expression. For a moment, the boy glanced around, searching for another person that Shoto could possibly be speaking to, only to find himself and the stranger around. When his attention returned to the dual-color-haired hero student, he looked like he'd seen a ghost. Not that Shoto believed in ghosts. The boy straightened from his position on the railing, turning his body to fully face Shoto. "Are you talking to me?" he asked, his voice small as he weakly pointed to himself with a scarred hand. For all the times that Shoto had seen the boy, he never noticed the scars littering his pale body. They wrapped around his hands in jagged lines that also slithered up his forearms before disappearing beneath the short sleeves of his t-shirt. One marred his cheek, tracing down the column of this throat and ending somewhere below his neckline. Distantly, Shoto wondered where they came from. It was possible that the boy had received them in a fight, or multiple considering the sheer amount of them, but he didn't seem like the type. He didn't exactly possess a muscular build. He was lanky and thin, all skin and bones. However, body structure meant nothing in the face of quirks. Perhaps he had a powerful quirk that got him into trouble a lot. If they weren't from a fight, maybe the boy had been in an accident. Anything was possible, but Shoto would never ask directly. Not when he didn't even know the kid. He had his own scar that encircled his left eye, and if someone he didn't know suddenly asked about it, he would have snapped at them. But the boy didn't seem to pick anger as his first response when it came to interactions. He wasn't like one of Shoto's classmates. The boy's voice was soft, gentle, like how one would speak to a cornered animal. Yet, there was a dark undertone beneath his words that Shoto barely noticed. If he hadn't been paying attention, if he had been deceived by the innocent light gleaming in his eyes, Shudo knew he would have missed it. Shudo cocked an eyebrow. Who else would I be referring to? The boy's brow furrowed slightly as he awkwardly scratched the back of his neck. The dullness had faded from his eyes, replaced with a spark that Shudo couldn't quite identify. There was nothing particularly threatening in his stance or gaze, but he could sense a sort of wariness permeating from him. And Shudo wasn't simply going to forget the strange tone that lingered at the edge of his voice. For as much as Shudo hated the training his father forced upon him, it helped him read the boy before him like an open book. This has never happened before. I wonder. The boy murmured before a string of incoherent mutters fell from his mouth in a jumbled heap on the ground. His hand came up to his chin while the other was crossed against his chest as he spoke quickly beneath his breath. Shudo couldn't decipher a single word after the first sentence. The boy's words were too quiet for him to comprehend. The teenager seemed to realize he was being stared at and flinched. He laughed, awkwardness bleeding into the sound. Sorry about that. My quirk makes it difficult for me to communicate with others. It was obvious, at least to Shudo, that he was hesitant to speak. The way he stuttered over his words, how he chose every phrase with careful precision, was reminiscent of how Shudo spoke to his father. He wondered if the boy had experienced something similar to what Shudo had to make him act like that. Quirk, Shudo repeated curiously. The boy shrugged helplessly, a strange smile forming on his lips. Shudo had never been good at understanding social cues, but even to him, it seemed a little too forced to be completely believable. He nodded, waving his hand to get Shudo's attention. Shudo watched as the boy's hand phased right through the metal bars with little effort. It reminded him of a third year back at UA that was at the top of his class with a similar quirk called permeation. Could it have been a coincidence, or were they related somehow? Are you Mirio Togata's little brother or something? The stranger cocked his head like a confused kitten, his lips parting a little in surprise. If he was offended by how bluntly Shudo had asked, it didn't show on his freckled face. Instead, it seemed like his curiosity was growing. He whispered the name softly to himself before shaking his head. No, I don't know who that is, he stated, becoming a little more confident with his words. Oh, Shudo replied, not completely convinced, but he wouldn't push the issue. You just have similar quirks. He can phase through objects too? The boy nodded, his expression calculative. Interesting, he murmured, his voice trailing off as he gazed intently at the ground in thought. Shudo stared at him for a heartbeat before coming to a decision he prayed he wouldn't regret later. My name's Shudo Todoroki. I'm a first year at UA's hero course. The boy's eyes widened. Suddenly, excitement flooded through his entire system as a large grin plastered itself onto his pale face. His body seemed to be physically vibrating as he jumped up and down like a kid in a candy store. That means you're training to be a hero, right? That's so cool. I heard that All Might was a teacher there this year. Does he teach one of your classes? And Eraserhead and Present Mike are teachers too, aren't they? That must be amazing to have so many pro heroes around you all the time. There must also be a lot of really powerful, strength-based quirks considering what the entrance exam was, but I bet there are quite a few technical-based quirks too. Though, probably not in the hero course. Maybe in the general education or support courses. I wish I could see them all, he exclaimed, a certain brightness entering his green irises that Shudo had never seen before today. He was doing the muttering thing again, but this time the volume was a little louder with the thirst for knowledge. Shudo merely stared at the boy, his jaw dropping lamely. He honestly wasn't sure if he actually wanted Shudo to answer or not, and if he did, what order would he answer them? Should he attack the important ones first? In order of which he said them? Not answer at all? Were they just the ramblings of a fanboy? Shudo had no idea how to deal with fanboys. It was the one thing his father never taught him. The boy had the sense to look sheepish as he wrung his hands nervously in front of him. Sorry, you don't have to answer any of those. I just have a fascination with heroes and quirks is all, he added, seeing the hero in training's confusion. Shudo noticed. But something in the boy's ramblings stuck out to him, something he didn't think a normal person would know. You knew what was in the UA's entrance exam? Shudo inquired, eyes narrowing slightly. Does that mean you took it? The boy quickly shook his head, waving his hands back and forth violently. Oh no no no, he spat out in a rush as though he was afraid that Shudo would get the wrong idea if he didn't say it fast enough. I just have an old friend that took the exam and made it into UA. I didn't take it myself. Shudo took a mental note of the boy's boisterous personality that bounced him off every wall in a matter of a few seconds. There was a natural nervousness to him, one that blanketed the darkness that Shudo had noticed in the very beginning, but it was still there. It was hiding beneath a dozen layers of excitement and skittishness, and Shudo wasn't naive. Darkness like that didn't just vanish simply because you wanted it to. The boy was awfully good at hiding it though. What's your name? Shudo asked, shoving his hands in the pockets of his pants. The boy froze for a moment, seeming to contemplate something in his head, probably whether or not it was worth telling a stranger his name. After a few heartbeats, the boy put more force behind his smile as though he could possibly make it any brighter or larger. Deku, he announced, almost proudly. They call me Deku? Shudo blinked in surprise, taken aback by his answer. Deku meant useless, which was a strange name to give your child, Shudo thought, but he didn't say any of it aloud. It was more likely that it was just an old nickname, judging by the way he phrased his words. It's nice to meet you, Deku. The boy just beamed brighter. And what Shudo didn't know was that he would come to regret that day. It wouldn't settle in right away, wouldn't morph into regret immediately, but soon he'd learn. He'd regret. The day he met the boy who glowered down at the traffic below him. The day he saw the boy, alone, in the spot he had been for the last month or so. The day he decided to speak to the boy leaning against the railing. Shudo would consider himself to be a brave person, unless he was faced with his father. His father scared him. He never voiced that thought aloud, only due to the fact that no one would believe him. They would only sneer in his direction, their eyes harsh and unforgiving. It had happened far too many times in the past to expect anything different now. How could the son of the number 2 hero be terrified of his father after all? Endeavor was a hero. He was brave and strong. He put his life on the line to save others. He only wanted what was best for his children. He wanted them to grow up to their full potential. He may be strict, but that was no reason to hate him. They would say that Shudo was just another rich brat that selfishly detested his father's guts for no other reason than he could. No one knew the real Endeavor, the one that he was behind the cameras and publicity. Everyone assumed he was a loving man, a good person, even when no one was looking, just like he was on screen. They were mistaken. They were so horribly mistaken. They didn't know the Endeavor that forced his mother into a Quirk marriage so his children could surpass All Might. They didn't know the Endeavor that beat his children when they failed to comply with his orders. They didn't know the Endeavor that drove his wife to insanity. The one that led to her pouring boiling water on her youngest son's face because it reminded her of him. They didn't know the Endeavor that brutally struck Shudo during every training session. They didn't know the man that forced him to grow up separately from his siblings because they were little more than failures in his heartless eyes. In reality, no one but his own family really knew Endeavor at all. The rest were too blinded by his fame to notice that he wasn't what they thought he was. The image of him that they created was false, but humanity was stubborn. They would refuse to believe anything that shattered their precious vision of heroes. So instead of confronting the issue, Shudo chose to run. Endeavor had already forced 3 hours of relentless training upon him that morning, stating that UA's training methods were flawed and would only hinder him. He had to be strong. He had to rise above the rest of his classmates. He couldn't afford to have friendships or emotional connections to any of them. They were weak and pathetic. Shudo Todoroki had to be better than all of them if he wanted to surpass All Might. Shudo Todoroki couldn't be weak. Shudo Todoroki had to be better. He sprinted through the woods, his body aching with every step. His lungs were burning in protest. They had been doing so since he started, but he ignored the pain. He needed to escape. He needed to breathe. He didn't want to return home. No, not yet. He would go back long after Endeavor was gone so he could spend a few peaceful moments with Fuyumi. She would be waiting for him with gentle hands and a sorrowful smile, and she'd treat his wounds silently, without so much as a breathe. He hated that she was the one who had to mend his broken pieces, but there weren't many options anymore. Not since Mother was taken away. Shudo didn't stop running until he broke through the tree line. There was a small lake that his mother used to take him to after a particularly rough training session with his father. She would sit by the waterside with him, slowly stroking his hair until he calmed down. She would rarely say a word, choosing silence so they both could listen to the sound of water lapping against the rocks surrounding the lake. His mother was gone now, locked away in a mental hospital, but the lake remained the same. The water was a bright, crystal blue that reflected the sunlight in sparkling glimmers. Rocks, some as small as pebbles while others were as large as boulders, dusted the water's edge to prevent erosion to the land. Tall trees surrounded the perimeter of the water, dotting the world around him various shades of green. They provided protection from the June heat as some of their leaves dipped into the lake, forming gentle ripples along the surface. It had been his sanctuary, one that Endeavor knew nothing about. Shudo huffed loudly, kneeling over as he fought to catch his breath. Every muscle throbbed as he rested his hands on his knees, his back groaning as he bent over. He knew without even having to look in a mirror that he would have a nasty bruise blooming on the small of his back. He remembered the way Endeavor had flipped him over his shoulder like he was nothing, his back colliding harshly with the training room's floor. Because to Endeavor, Shudo was nothing more than a means to an end. He wondered if he would be healed enough come Monday morning so he wouldn't have to suffer through hero training at school. He had done so before, but he would prefer not to make his classmates and teachers suspicious as to why he was always injured in some way, shape, or form. He didn't think he could come up with a viable excuse if they asked. After a few minutes, he had finally calmed down enough that breathing didn't feel like he was shoving burning coals down his lungs. The rest of his body still ached as though it had been run over by a bus, only for that bus to reverse back over him for a second time. For some reason, his father had been a little angrier than usual that morning. His turquoise blue eyes had been alight and burning with something cruel and merciless. He hadn't hesitated to take out all his frustrations on Shudo during training. Shudo just hoped that whatever the cause was, it would disappear so Endeavor wasn't in the same mood come tomorrow morning. He didn't think he could handle 2 days of wrathful training. On top of Yue's regime, it would be nearly impossible. Todoroki? Shudo's head shot up at the sound of his name coming from a growingly familiar voice. He wondered if he was going crazy. He couldn't have been there, it was impossible. He must have hit his head sometime during training and was hallucinating because there was no way. Deku was sitting beneath a tree, a few feet away from the water, staring at him with concerned green eyes. Eyes that disappeared when a cat jumped through his head. Shudo blinked, genuinely concerned for his mentality for a moment. Deku? He questioned, though his eyes were locked on the gray and white tabby that was attempting to claw the boy's eyes out, rather unsuccessfully. And judging by the way it hissed at every failed attempt, the cat knew it wasn't accomplishing much. "What are you doing here?" Deku followed Shudo's gaze to the tabby that was trying to stab him with its vicious claws. "I made a new friend, but it turns out she's a bit clingier than I originally thought," he explained, gesturing towards the cat with a glare that would have been believable had Deku not been grinning from ear to ear. "I tried running away from her, but apparently she can't take a hint, isn't that right, Miss Fluffernugget?" He cooed, reaching out to pet her, only for his hands to pass right through her body. Shudo's lips parted, 1,000 words rushing through his skull. He wasn't even sure where to start, there were just so many things wrong with this picture. "You named your cat Miss Fluffernugget?" "First off, she's not my cat," Deku corrected nonchalantly, holding up a finger. "Second, I didn't come up with that name. It was already written on her collar." Shudo could only shake his head in disbelief. "You ran all the way here, just to get away from a cat named Miss Fluffernugget?" Murmured, more to himself than to the boy before him. Shudo wasn't sure whether to write him off as insane or determined. There was a thin line between the two that Deku seemed to be balancing on. He wondered if Deku knew that that was a dangerous line to walk. If a cat had been trying to scratch out your eyes for the past 3 hours, you'd probably do the same, Deku huffed, running a hand through his curls. Somehow, despite their unruliness, his fingers didn't get stuck between his wild locks. Flashes of the past 3 hours of his life played behind his eyelids, violent and messy and full of pain. Shudo didn't mention what had ended just a few minutes prior. The mere memory of it made him involuntarily flinch. His reaction didn't go unnoticed by Deku. His light-hearted expression faded as his brows furrowed. Shudo had to suppress a shudder when Deku's analytical eyes began to roam his battered body, easily pinpointing each weakness, each bruise, and each cut that was sprinkled across his skin. It felt as though Deku was slowly dissecting him, layer by layer, until he found exactly what he was searching for. What it was, Shudo didn't know, but he knew the exact moment Deku found it. Something cold passed across his face before dissipating into nothing. Deku didn't say a word as he scooted over on the grass further beneath the tree so there was more room in the shade. He patted the ground beside him, silently inviting Shudo to sit. Shudo cautiously walked forward, hesitantly accepting Deku's invitation, or perhaps it was more like a gentle order. He wasn't sure. Whatever it was, he wasn't going to decline it. He sat beside the boy, the tabby jumping away to Deku's other side. Deku didn't take his eyes off him the entire time, watching his every move with careful patience. There was a moment of uncomfortable silence where Shudo only watched the poor tabby hiss at the green-haired boy, completely ignoring the way Deku's eyes trailed along each bruise on Shudo's body. A heartbeat passed before Deku offered a weak smile. I heard that dogs are a man's best friend, but unfortunately, I only have a temperamental cat. Close enough, right? He mused, scratching the back of his head. His attempt at comforting Shudo didn't go unnoticed, but neither one openly acknowledged that fact. I would throw her in your lap, but I can't pick her up. Shudo tilted his head slightly, latching on to his words as they offered a merciful distraction from the raging storm in his mind. You can't turn your quirk off? Deku's eye twitched as a nervous laugh escaped his lips. If there is a way, I haven't discovered it yet. But as of now, no, everything just dash. He tried to pet the cat once more, only to receive the same result as before, phases right through. Something in the tone of Deku's voice forced Shudo to look away from the boy. There was a certain level of anguish coating his words that Shudo had a feeling he wasn't supposed to hear. He knew a little something about vulnerability and how much humans hated others to see theirs. So he pretended that he didn't notice the way Deku's eyes dimmed or the way his voice dipped a little lower than usual. It's not that your quirk allows you to pass through objects, it's that your body is in a state of intangibility, he said, not bothering to phrase it as a question. Deku pursed his lips in thought, tilting his head in such a way that his hair covered his eyes. Amongst other things, I suppose, he murmured, his teeth gnawing at his bottom lip. Once again, the deafening silence returned as their conversation died out. Miss Fluffernugget had jumped over Deku, landing on Shudo's lap sometime during that short period of time. She nuzzled her small head into his stomach, specifically on his left side, gently purring. Shudo ran his fingers through her gray and white fur as she made her home in his lap. Deku threw a betrayed scowl at the tabby, shaking his head before his gaze settled on Shudo's split knuckles. Yet, the boy remained dutifully quiet. You're not going to ask? Shudo inquired, clenching his fists which sent a dull wave of pain through his hands. Do you want me to? Shudo thought about it honestly. He had only known Deku for a couple of days, and even then, this was only their second time speaking to each other. It seemed strange to spill all of Shudo's personal baggage on a boy he barely knew anything about. It was like it was crossing some sort of strange, social barrier that he had no right crossing yet. So he shook his head. Then I won't, Todoroki, Deku said, the small grin returning to his expression, but it wasn't the same as before. This time around, it was like there was some inside joke that only Deku knew while Shudo remained oblivious. If you ever decide you want to talk, I'll always be around to listen. I have nothing but time. Shudo's gaze fell to the grass between them. Enough time to run from a cat for 3 hours? He quipped softly, but Deku still heard it. The boy burst out laughing, the sound full of amusement and unhindered joy. What else would I be doing? Izuku knew that what he was doing was cruel. He knew that he had no right befriending Todoroki, not when he had been lying to him since the moment they met on that overpass. Not when Todoroki had a long life of heroism and accomplishments ahead of him while Izuku would remain the same, pitifully small child he always had been. Not when Todoroki was still so full of life and had so much left to offer the world while Izuku had already died after achieving nothing. It was cruel and heartless and selfish. He wasn't supposed to be selfish. If Todoroki learned the truth about him, learned what happened to him, Izuku wondered how he'd react. It would be nothing good, he thought. If that ever happened, Todoroki would probably confront him, demanding answers that Izuku would be too scared to give. Though, ultimately, Izuku would offer them because he didn't like hurting people. He didn't like being selfish. What would happen then? Izuku had been elated when Todoroki came to speak to him as though he was just another person walking the streets. He had spent the last 8 months of his afterlife only able to watch as the world moved on, abandoning him in the dust and shadows. But Todoroki saw him, spoke to him. Izuku didn't want to be alone again, but was it worth potentially hurting a newfound friend, if you could even call them that yet, just so a dead boy didn't have to be tortured with solitude? As Izuku watched Todoroki become engrossed in stroking Miss Fluffernugget's fur, utterly enraptured by her purring, a sad smile crept up his lips. All he should have been able to do was watch. He wondered if this was temporary, if this was just his final taste of bliss before he disappeared completely. If that were the case, he would be fine with it. It was more than he deserved anyway. "Hey, Deku," Todoroki called out, a questioning tone in his voice. Izuku immediately dropped his smile in favor of a brighter one. Would you like to be friends?" Todoroki didn't look up from petting the tabby when he asked this question, almost as if he was too shy to see Izuku's expression. The boy was silently grateful for it because he didn't think Todoroki would like the glassy look in his eyes. He wanted to be friends with a ghost. Izuku wanted to accept, no matter the cost, but something held him back. If he said yes, then Todoroki would only get hurt in the end. There was no way he could keep up this charade forever, and when the curtains finally fell, he didn't want to imagine the damage he would leave in his wake. But if he said no, if he denied Todoroki this simple request, what did that make him? Cruel? Heartless? Izuku pursed his lips into something that may have resembled a grin. It didn't matter though, Todoroki wasn't looking. "You just want the cat, don't you?" he retorted playfully. But Todoroki was anything but joking. His head snapped up from Miss Fluffernugget, his eyes burning with determination. His expression morphed into one of complete seriousness, one that was almost childish in Izuku's opinion. "No," he stated firmly, the glimmer in his heterochromia eyes growing brighter. "I want to be your friend." Oh god. Izuku was definitely going to hell after this. "But yes, I want Miss Fluffernugget as well." Izuku snorted before a sudden burst of laughter exploded from his lips, falling on his back as he rolled around. He felt tears forming in his eyes for the first time in quite a while, but they weren't from sadness. No, these were tears of joy. Todoroki was too precious for this world. He decided right then and there. "Is it really that terrible of an idea?" Todoroki asked, his voice tightening in a way that made Izuku freeze. Izuku immediately silenced himself, sitting back up and facing him directly, adopting Todoroki's seriousness. He stared into his blue and gray eyes unblinkingly, holding the boy's gaze for a few seconds before speaking. "It's not a terrible idea at all," Izuku said, straightening his posture. Even if he would come to regret this decision later, it didn't matter. He would deal with the repercussions of his actions and selfishness later. "I would love to be your friend, Todoroki. Though I can't promise you Miss Fluffernugget, she really isn't my cat to give." Todoroki's lips curled up just a fraction, but Izuku would consider it a smile all the same. "I'm sorry, Todoroki. Just this once, can you forgive my self-serving desire not to be alone again? If in the end you decide to hate me, I'll accept that hatred and leave you be. Just for now, let me be your friend." Aizawa was not a superstitious man by nature, but there were times when one had no other choice but to believe what was before them. Shoyuda preferred straight facts that held little to no room for doubt. Theories and conspiracies were all well and good, only if there was hard evidence to back them up. He didn't believe anything blindly. He needed to see it with his own 2 eyes before he could decide for himself whether or not it was true. He was stubborn in this respect, but his stubbornness didn't corrode his vision. He could accept if he was wrong or if his doubts were unfounded. He absolutely did not believe in the supernatural, no matter how much Hisashi, his best friend since his school days, tried to convince him that his new apartment had to be haunted after Shoyuta told him about the strange noises that erupted in the early morning hours. He trusted Hisashi's words more than anyone else's, but Shoyuta also knew that Hisashi was high-spirited and believed in every horror story he'd ever heard. Hisashi wasn't like the underground hero. Shoyuta preferred any option that made the most sense, regardless of if it was realistic or not. And a ghost haunting Shuta's apartment made the most sense to Hisashi. Personally, Shoyuta suspected it was his cats that were making all the ruckus, but he could never seem to catch them in the act. One of his cats, a gray and white tabby, had always been a bit short-tempered and capricious. She tended to value destruction over napping under his furniture like his other cat. At first, he had blamed her primarily for the sounds he heard if he was home during the nighttime. But when she went missing one day and the noises continued, Shoyuta was beginning to look in other directions for the blame. He had thought that perhaps someone had been breaking into his apartment, but when morning came, there were no signs of entry. All the windows and doors were locked up tightly, and nothing was missing or stolen. Nothing had been moved either, not even the slightest bit. Though, that meant nothing if the perpetrator had a quirk that made access to locked rooms easier. In this world, quirks could often explain the unexplainable. Shoyuta decided to set up cameras around in each room to see if he could catch footage of anything useful, but to no avail. The only thing he caught on camera was some unusual behavior coming from his cat, Fuyu, a white Persian longhair that resembled a ball of fluff. She was the complete opposite of the cat that had disappeared. She was calm and lazy, preferring to sleep anywhere she could fit in. But that night, sometime around 4 in the morning, she had crawled out from beneath his sofa only to sit in the middle of the living room, staring at seemingly nothing. Shoyuta wasn't particularly bothered by it. Cats were strange, fickle creatures. What bothered him about the clip was how Fuyu had begun to meow and claw at the air, as though she could see something that he couldn't. It had led him to believe that perhaps the perpetrator had some sort of invisibility quirk, or at least, they possessed one that made them unable to be detected by cameras and technology. Anything was possible in this world. However, the cameras revealed that none of the doors or windows had been opened, not even the slightest bit. Unless the person had multiple quirks, it didn't make much sense to him. It was certainly possible to possess more than one. A student of his at UA, Shudo Todoroki, had 2 aspects, but it was an extremely rare and unlikely occurrence. After 2 weeks and no results, Shoyuta was beginning to believe that he was just imagining the soft voices at night. He wasn't known for getting a lot of sleep. Between his hero work at night and his responsibilities as a teacher at UA, there was very little time to take care of himself properly. It was entirely possible that he was wearing himself out and simply hallucinating the noises in his exhausted state. His new students were certainly capable of giving him more stress than past years, especially that loud, problem child, Katsuki Bakugo. He wrote it off as his sleep-deprived state getting the better of him until Hisashi stayed the night and awoke to the same sounds that Shoyuta had lived with for the last few weeks. He wordlessly shook Shoyuta awake, who was sleeping beside him in bed. The underground hero groggily got up, and his eyes snapping open when he heard the reason why Hisashi's green eyes were uncharacteristically serious. Soft whimpers of tears that were poorly suppressed echoed down the hallway and into his bedroom. Though Shoyuta would say he was used to the noises after over 2 weeks of listening to it, he had never heard sobbing before today. It was usually quiet murmurs that he could not comprehend, maybe sometimes even gentle laughter, but never once had tears been involved. "Are you sure it's not a ghost problem?" Hisashi joked beneath his breath, but his tone was anything but amused. It was the first time in a while that Shoyuta had seen the man without his usual, bright grin. Shoyuta threw a glare that held no real force behind it at Hisashi before kicking away his blanket from around his legs. As quietly as he was able to without alerting whoever may be in his house, he pulled on his pants that had been left discarded on the floor and grabbed his capture scarf from his bedside table. He didn't bother with a shirt. Time was of the essence. Hisashi followed his lead, pushing back his long, blonde hair with his hands. "It's not a ghost problem," Shoyuta muttered, wrapping part of his capture scarf around his neck. Shoyuta carefully pushed open the door from his bedroom, glancing down the hallway before exiting. The sobbing was louder now as it bounced off each wall in the entire apartment, haunting and dripping a raw sorrow that made shivers creep down the man's spine. The fragile noises were muffled as though the person responsible was deliberately trying to choke them down. They sounded young, too, much younger than Shoyuta or Hisashi. Perhaps it was a child that broke into his home? He sneaked down into where the living room and the dining room converged into one large area. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Shoyuta didn't immediately notice anything that seemed out of place or that there was even a perpetrator at all. Yet the sobbing was so loud, so heartbroken that there was no way the person couldn't have been in the same room as them. Then Hisashi sucked in a breath beside Shura's ear. That's when he noticed the boy hunched over on the ground in his living room. Darkness coated the room in a thick layer, but Shoyuta was accustomed to the shadows after years of living in them. It came with his late-night shifts and job as an underground hero. Sitting in the center of his living room was a small figure clawing at his head as his shoulders trembled violently. His short, curly hair was clenched between unforgiving fingers as he ripped at the strands. The cries had been silenced or at least stifled, but Shoyuta suspected that the tears were still there. The boy had his back turned towards them, and he hadn't detected their presence yet. It may have been from lack of sleep, but Shoyuta swore that the boy's body flickered in the faint moonlight pouring in from the window. Each time, a familiar scent of iron filled the air, only growing stronger as the clock ticked further into the night. Incoherent, panicked mutters spilled from his lips in place of his previous cries. Shoyuta couldn't decipher a single word that was being spoken through the breathless whispers. Yet, it only confirmed his suspicions of it being a boy sobbing in his living room. Shoyuta glanced at Hisashi, who was standing behind him, and they shared a brief look. His eyes were practically screaming, "I told you so," the entire time. The underground hero only nudged him with his elbow in response. The boy couldn't have been much younger than his first-year students at UA. Shoyuta couldn't see his face, so he couldn't be entirely sure, but he did see a full head of green curls that appeared black in the darkness. The boy's arms were wrapped around his knees as he slowly rocked back and forth on the floor. His muttering grew softer as his words sped up. Why was there a child having a panic attack in his living room? "Hey kid, what are you doing here? Did you stumble into the wrong apartment or something?" Shoyuta demanded, forcing his voice into indifference. He knew full well that he had locked all of the doors and windows, so there was no possible way this kid could have stumbled into the wrong apartment. Yet, there was something about the kid that didn't send Shura's nerves off the deep end despite the fact that he was a possible intruder. Even though his senses were telling him that the boy wasn't a threat, Shoyuta wasn't stupid nor ignorant enough to lower his guard so easily. Hisashi rested his hand on Shura's shoulder, squeezing slightly as if to warn him not to fall for any tricks the boy might pull. Shoyuta replied by tightening his grip on the capture scarf. The kid froze, his voice cutting off abruptly as though the air had been stolen from his lungs. Slowly, as if trapped in some sort of trance, he turned to look over his left shoulder at the pro-heroes. Blood dripped down the side of his face from a slit hidden by his hair, but the blood seemed to flicker with the boy's body, growing transparent like a hologram. That would explain why the room smelled oddly metallic. But there wasn't enough on the boy to explain why it was so strong. Unless... The boy's green eyes widened as he met Shachua's gaze, his bottom lip trembling in fear. A glassy sheen mixed with blood streamed down his face, dripping off his chin to stain his white t-shirt. Shoyuta couldn't see the front, but with such a strong scent of blood permeating throughout the room, he had to have some major injuries. Or it was all just an illusion. Shoyuta used his quirk, his eyes glowing red in the dark of the living room. He felt his hair rise up as his quirk activated, but nothing else happened. The boy's almost transparent body didn't solidify, the blood didn't disappear, nothing. It wasn't a quirk. Or at the very least, the boy before him wasn't the person casting the illusion. Shoyuta Aizawa wasn't a superstitious man. He didn't believe in what his eyes couldn't see. He didn't believe in urban legends or silly ghost stories that people told around a campfire. It was all ridiculous nonsense that some thought to be amusing. Until it wasn't just ridiculous nonsense. "I didn't break in," the boy breathed, his voice tight as though he'd rather be anywhere else but in Shura's living room. Your cat brought me here. He scrambled to his feet stiffly as though even the slightest movement caused him excruciating pain. Shoyuta finally realized why the scent of blood hung so heavily in his living room. The boy's entire shirt front was drenched in scarlet liquid. Every inch of skin that he could see was painted a sickly hue with some sort of cut or bruise trailing in every direction imaginable. Along the boy's face, a particularly nasty cut sliced down from his right cheek to his chest. Blood bubbled from his wounds, but Shoyuta was mostly worried about that one. It was dangerously close to his carotid artery. The boy could have nicked it, which would explain why it was bleeding so profusely. There was no way the boy should have been this lucid if he had lost that much blood. He shouldn't have even been able to stand straight, if at all. Shuta's gaze fell to the ground where the boy had sat, only to see a familiar gray and white tabby glaring back up at him. She was the one that had been missing for a few days. "What are you doing in my living room at 3 a.m., covered in blood?" The boy flinched, his emerald eyes contorting in pain before he glanced down at himself with obvious disgust. His cracked, bloodied lips pursed. "I was annoyed that Miss Fluffernugget kept trying to rip my eyeballs out, so I brought her home." Shoyuta blinked. His cat's name wasn't Miss Fluffernugget, but that was definitely his cat that accompanied the strange, battered boy. Her name was actually Luna. Who would name their cat? Shoyuta glowered at Hisashi beside him, who was too busy focusing on the sight before them to notice. He probably had it engraved on her collar. "That doesn't explain why you're here at 3 a.m., little listener, or why you're a bloody mess," Hisashi said, his voice deathly calm despite his otherwise boisterous personality. The boy's body spasmed once more, his blood momentarily replaced with a black, middle school uniform. The material was dyed darker with the same scarlet liquid that covered the boy before, but this time, parts of his uniform were torn. It was only for a heartbeat. Shoyuta was sure he would have missed it if he blinked, but he saw it all. Maybe Hisashi wasn't so crazy about that ghost theory after all. Though Shoyuta was still a little skeptical. The green-haired boy avoided their gazes, his eyes darting around to room, pinpointing each exit possible. "I was trying not to, interrupt your lives," he stuttered, smearing some of the blood on his face with his equally dirted hand. "As for why I look like this, you probably wouldn't believe me." Hisashi elbowed the underground hero in the side. "As I said before, Shoyuta, you have a ghost problem." He gloated, a proud grin lighting up his features. The boy's head shot up at Hisashi's words, his puffy eyes as wide as dinner plates. "Okay, so maybe you will believe me," the boy whispered so softly that Shoyuta barely caught it. The boy closed his eyes, an internal war probably raging in his head, before the blood faded from his body and clothes. The injuries he sustained scarred over, leaving behind a collection of jagged, silvery tissue. His body solidified, the constant flickering ceasing. He looked like any other teenager right then, but Shouta wasn't deceived by pretty pictures. Shoyuta sighed. He was really too tired to deal with this right now. He had another problem child in his life, this one just possibly die. A young teenager, probably no older than his students, was standing before him, dead. Judging from the amount of blood that had been on his body, it wasn't a peaceful death. Though, when you were that young, was any death really peaceful? That was only if what the boy was insinuating was true. "You're actually?" Shoyuta let his question trail off, but the boy was smart enough to know where he was going with it. "Dead?" he finished, a bit too nonchalantly to be believably calm. Nervous laughter escaped his lips as his hand rose to scratch the back of his head. "Yeah, I was in a freak accident and, well, obviously didn't make it." Perhaps if Shoyuta had been gullible, he would have taken every word the boy uttered as the truth. He would have taken those words and stored them away in the recesses of his mind, but he wasn't. He didn't. In all of his years as an underground hero, he learned how to detect lies and half-truths. While the boy may not have been outright lying, there was something major he was leaving out or sugarcoating. If the boy had actually died, it would make sense to censor the details to prevent himself from remembering them or to spare someone else from the mental images. "And you've been haunting my apartment for the last 2 weeks because—" "I used to live here," he said, but his voice was questioning as though he was confused. "My mom moved out, and I Couldn't exactly follow her. So, I just stayed, I guess. Shoyuta examined the boy from head to toe with a tired gaze. He was lanky and a little on the short side, probably labeled as just another average kid when he was still alive. His looks revealed no obvious hint of what his quirk might have been if he even possessed one in the first place. In fact, he was a little plain-looking if Shoyuta was being completely honest. He wouldn't stand out in a world without quirks, certainly not in this one. Not unless he had a flashy and strong power that counteracted his simple appearance. "What's your name?" Shoyuta inquired, flipping the rest of his capture scarf around his neck. This boy wasn't a threat. Not yet, at least. He only stared at the underground hero for a moment, fear fading from his features fraction by fraction. Now, there was only a cold sort of calculative persona taking over. It reminded Shoyuta of the way his cats looked before they pounced on a mouse, predatory and thoughtful in their every movement. It was like the boy was mapping out if he should offer Shoyuta the answers or do something else entirely. Perhaps Shoyuta was a little too quick to judge the boy. He forgot to consider his mental capabilities. Izuku Midoriya. The next morning, Shoyuta tried to ignore his latest addition to his group of problem children as he prepared to head over to UA for work, but Midoriya was difficult to ignore when he was haphazardly floating around the living room. It was strange, especially given Shuta's pragmatic nature, but he was slowly learning to process it. Hizashi had left a little earlier to finish some last-minute grading, so Shoyuta didn't have to worry about that nutcase. He just had to worry about a dead teenager doing continuous flips in midair in his living room. They had talked for a little longer last night before Shoyuta threw in the towel and went to sleep. Midoriya had no idea why he was still around or how he or Hizashi were able to see him. The problem child briefly mentioned that another person had been able to interact with him, a student, but didn't give out many details. The boy had been dead for 8 months and counting, and he had mostly been wandering around the city out of boredom. Shoyuta didn't ask him any more questions about how he died. He had agreed to allow Midoriya to stay in his apartment, almost like a home he could always return to, but Shoyuta wasn't that sentimental. He only allowed it because the green-haired troublemaker had lived there before him, and Shoyuta thought that it would be safer for the general public if he ensured that the ghost would haunt only one area instead of wandering about senselessly. His only condition was that Midoriya had to stop making noise in the middle of the night. When Shoyuta brought this up, Midoriya had cocked his head and nodded, but he said nothing in reply. By the time the underground hero was out the door, the problem child had disappeared from the apartment. He could only imagine how the kid spent his free time and prayed he wasn't getting himself into trouble. That day was the battle trial he had been preparing with all might to test 1A's teamwork and fighting abilities. It ended with no serious injuries, though Todoroki did freeze his opponents in a small glacier of ice. However, with his fire side he managed to melt it, freeing his 2 classmates. Shoyuta had to commend the kid. He was powerful, but he was only limiting himself by primarily using his ice quirk. If he wanted to reach his full potential, he would have to learn to utilize both, but that would be for another time. The end of the day came slower than the underground hero would have preferred, but it came nonetheless. Class had been dismissed, and his students were packing up when he overheard Momo Yaoyorozu commenting on a nasty scratch on Todoroki's hand. Shoyuta had glanced over towards the back of the room where they sat. He didn't remember Todoroki getting hurt during the battle trial. There was really no chance to when he demolished the other team in a single strike. Unless, of course, he managed to graze his hand on a chunk of his own ice, which was unlikely. It was a cat, Todoroki stated simply. Aizawa had noticed that he seemed to be a little closed off from his other classmates, focusing more on succeeding at becoming a hero than personal friendships. Lately, there was a small change. It was infinitesimal, but Aizawa always had a good eye. The sun of endeavor appeared to be slowly opening up, but only on occasion. Yaoyorozu blinked in surprise. "You have a cat, Todoroki?" "No, a cat kept following my friend, and she scratched me when I was trying to leave. She was mean." Shoyuta was reminded of Luna and Midoriya. The problem child did mention how the other person who could see him was a student, plus Luna, or Miss Fluffernugget as Midoriya called her, was aggressive when faced with new people. But could Midoriya have been talking about Todoroki? No, probably not. Izuku Midoriya had never minded loneliness. There were a multitude of times in his life when solitude was a bitter necessity that he took with a grain of salt. He feared that if those moments did not exist, he would have broken like a glass vase carelessly thrown onto the floor, and no amount of glue could piece him back together again. He required moments where the only noise was the furious scratching of his pencil against his notebook paper as he wrote every detail he could remember about Heroes down. He needed silence. He needed a lack of human interaction because he wasn't like everyone else he knew. Quirkless kids were the ones who desired loneliness because they feared that if they were surrounded by people who only offered cruelty with a smile, they would drown. Izuku preferred loneliness to cruelty. No one but himself could hurt him if he were alone. No one cared enough to hurt him, to break through his barriers and actually mean something to him. Those who once did abandoned him when they figured out he was nothing more than a useless waste of space. His mother had been there for him, at least. She had a warm presence that made him feel safe when everything around him was falling apart. It was as though she knew just what to say or do to comfort him. Inko Midoriya was the reason he continued on, even when everything seemed hopeless. Izuku loved her more than anything in this world, but he also knew that she sacrificed everything to support him. She was a clever woman, but Izuku knew that she was deceiving him on multiple accounts. His mother wore a brave face in front of him, always the same, blindingly bright smile that seemed to fool everyone else but him. He knew that she was exhausted. She was forced to work countless hours to provide for her small family of 2, and then after, she had to raise her son alone, practically from birth. She once told him that his father, a man named Hisashi Midoriya, was busy working overseas, and he couldn't come home often because his work was too important. Izuku suspected this was true, probably in the very beginning, when he was too young to remember. Back then, his father used to send emails or call whenever he was free. His mother had always been overjoyed when his father called. It wasn't long before the phone calls and emails came with longer intervals in between each, his words a little more clipped and short than they were in the past. Izuku didn't miss his father, not in a traditional sense, anyway. After all, how could you expect a small child to miss something that they didn't even remember? He pretended, of course, but only because he knew how much his mother loved his father. Inevitably, they lost all contact with Hisashi Midoriya sometime after Izuku's 4th birthday. Right up until the very end, Inko kept telling her son that his dad was working overseas and that he was just too busy at the moment to talk. Although, Izuku wasn't nearly as bothered by it as his mother thought he was. He knew the truth, knew what kind of man Hisashi was. It was easy to erase him from his life when Izuku knew why his father was really overseas. Despite the rough life she was forced to live, his mother always wore a convincing smile as if to tell him that no matter how many hardships they went through, they would get through them together and survive. That had always been the plan. They would get through it together. Izuku never planned on leaving his mother behind so soon. He never wanted to, but life was full of unwelcome surprises, of events that stacked upon each other to create an ugly future. Now the loneliness had returned, but this time, it was here to stay. It would be his constant companion through the small eternity he would be forced to witness. Even if Todoroki and Aizawa and Yamada were able to see him, to speak with him, they were temporary. They would eventually die as well, and there was no promise that they would remain by his side to keep him company in their afterlives. That was only assuming that Izuku was still around when they died. He could never ask that of them anyway. Izuku stopped his silent trek through the familiar woods, squashing down the faint tingle of pain that resided in his chest before continuing on. He knew these woods like the back of his hand. Once upon a time, he had spent countless hours exploring these woods with Kaken. They pretended they were heroes and saved the civilians from the imaginary villains, or they talked about All Might and how cool he was for hours on end. Of course, that had only been the beginning of the story. The rest wasn't as light-hearted and kind. There was one spot in particular that he was hunting for, one that only he and Kaken knew about. Even after all these years, Kaken had never brought his friends to where Izuku was heading. It was a special place meant specifically for the two of them, for Deku and Kaken. It was sometime in the late morning hours that Izuku managed to find the tree where Kaken and him had played beneath when they were younger. It was larger than the rest of the trees surrounding it, and for some reason that Izuku could never determine, no other trees dared to grow within a radius of 15 or so feet around it. This was the spot where Izuku had promised to become Katsuki Bakugo's sidekick when they both became heroes. If that dream hadn't died when they were 5, it was certainly dead now. Literally. The scenery hadn't changed much over the past few years, maybe grew a little wilder, a little older. The tree itself had a few more initials carved into its bark than the last time he had seen it, while some names had been completely scratched out. If he hadn't been looking, he would have believed that no one had come to this spot in a very long time. But Izuku had always been observant, always seeing the little things that others would normally dismiss. He noticed his hero analysis for the future number 13, which he thought had been destroyed, resting against the base of the tree. He noticed the small picture frame that held an image of his grinning face beside it. He noticed that his full name, his real name, was the latest addition to the ones already carved within the bark, and in smaller handwriting, Deku was written beneath the familiar writing. Izuku knew at least one person was here since the last time Kaken and he had come together. A small smile crept up his lips, but there was little joy behind it. If you think you'll have a quirk in your next life, go take a swan dive off the roof. The smile vanished. If living nightmares did exist, that day would have been his worst one. He had left that morning, his mother too busy to wave him goodbye, but he still yelled another, "I love you" and goodbye before he walked out the door. He didn't know if his mother had heard him, she was on the phone at the time, but he'd like to think she did. That morning, he said goodbye expecting to return later that night. She'd ask him about his day and he'd tell her it was fine, leaving out the cruel words that were spat at him, the number of punches and kicks that had landed on his body. She'd be incredibly sad if he told her the truth, so he didn't. He'd then do his homework as his mother was making supper. If he had time, he'd even help her, and he'd try not to make too much of a mess. They'd eat and laugh, and his mother would complain about one of her coworkers that were always snotty and lazy. They'd talk about heroes, and Izuku would go on and on about how amazing their quirks were, and he'd never stop. Until they finished cleaning up. He would go to bed and then be forced to wake up and do it all over again. But that never happened. Because Izuku Midoriya never made it back home that day. At first, school had been exactly like every other day. He sat quietly in his spot, sinking a little lower as to avoid unwanted attention, but he received it anyway. His teacher had called him out in front of the entire class because he put UA as one of the high schools he wished to attend. When Kaken heard that, he got angry. Kaken was always so angry back then. He had taken Izuku's hero analysis for the future number 13 and exploded it with a small burst of his nitroglycerin-based quirk before tossing it out the window, straight into a fountain where the koi fish had nibbled on the corners. He had been alone in homeroom with Kaken and a few of his followers. No one bothered to come to a quirkless boy's aid, especially when Katsuki Bakugo was the one messing with him. Izuku Midoriya wanted nothing more than to be alone in that moment, but Kaken had never been very good at listening. If you think you'll have a quirk in your next life, go take a swan dive off the roof. Kaken spat at him, all the venom in the world dripping from his words. Izuku had said nothing in reply. He couldn't even lift his eyes from the ground. He was terrified of his voice, of his words, of his quirk. They were all formed into a weapon to hurt him, and they were succeeding in every way possible. He flinched when those cruel words left Kaken's foul mouth, tears springing into his eyes, but he didn't let anyone but the floor see them. The words hurt more than if Kaken had blasted him in the face with his full power, but Izuku knew that they probably meant nothing. Unless they did. Kaken hated liars. Why would Kaken say something if he didn't mean every word? The rest had been a blur of tears as he trekked down to retrieve his notebook before it was utterly destroyed without any hope of being repaired. It was badly burnt, and the pages were soaked, but it might have been salvageable. If not, he had all of its contents memorized. He could just rewrite it all in another notebook. He was so caught up in examining the damage that he never noticed when two of Kaken's followers had come up behind him. They weren't smart, not in the least bit, but they always did what they thought Kaken would want most. Izuku didn't stand a chance. He shook off the memory before he went to a place he could no longer return from. He had already relived that final moment once. He didn't need a second time running around his head. What happened on that roof should stay on that roof. Izuku shoved his hands in the pockets of his shorts, gazing down at the memorabilia Kaken had probably left for him in a place they once called their hero HQ. 8 months ago, he had died in his middle school uniform, but over the last few months, he had learned that he could shape his appearance to some degree. It was mostly limited to his clothes as far as he was aware, but he had been too scared to test much else. He knew that if his emotions got the better of him, he'd appear as he had when he died, bloodied and broken. It was perhaps the reason why he was glad that his emotions were gradually numbing. What he really looked like when the illusion he wore fell scared him more than anything. To see what he had been reduced to, if he were able to sleep, he would have had nightmares. If he eventually felt nothing at all, he'd never have to see that gruesome sight again. He'd never have to relive that day over and over in a vicious, never-ending loop. It would be a tragic day. The day when the crybaby, over-emotional mess that was Izuku Midoriya felt absolutely nothing at all would be a tragic day that he would experience alone. It didn't matter if Todoroki, Aizawa, and Yamada were still alive at that point. If Izuku felt nothing, he doubted he'd care. He would abandon them just as he had done everyone else when he was still alive. They didn't know the Izuku he was when everyone could see what a pathetic excuse of a human he was. God, he didn't even fight back when. Izuku shook his head, his fingers tangling in his hair. He felt no pain at all, but it still helped to steady him. He wasn't going off the deep end quite yet. He still had a little bit of time left, he hoped. Izuku shoved it all down until he couldn't hear it anymore, until it stopped prickling at his mind. He might have been helping the numbing process along, but it didn't matter much at that moment. At that moment, Izuku didn't want to feel what that memory would bring with it. "Thank you, Kaken, for grabbing my notebook when I couldn't," he whispered as though someone could actually hear him. Even if he screamed with all his might, only 3 people that he knew could listen, and they were nowhere to be found. What a truly tragic and lonely day it was. If someone asked Aizawa if he regretted anything in his life, he would say nothing. He didn't regret his decision to become an underground hero, even if it meant that he didn't get to sleep as much as he wanted. When he expelled an entire class because he didn't think they were worthy of becoming heroes yet, he didn't feel particularly guilty. He certainly didn't lose sleep over it. When he and Hisashi entered a rather undefined and precarious relationship, Aizawa definitely didn't repent his decision. No, what Aizawa would come to regret the most would be his inability to protect his students. He saw potential for greatness in 1A, and some, without a doubt, were powerful, but that didn't mean they were prepared to fight villains. They were only first years. They were still going over the basics, the fundamentals. They hadn't learned how to fight against an enemy that wanted to kill them. The USJ incident, as the news would call it, would become Aizawa's greatest regret. Midoriya had returned by the time Aizawa woke up the next morning. The boy was sitting at the coffee table in the living room, his attention focused entirely on the pencil resting on top of the wood. His brow was furrowed in concentration as he slowly tried to wrap his fingers around the writing utensil, but it always slipped right through his skin. Aizawa didn't have to be a teacher to see the frustration frozen across Midoriya's face. "What are you doing, problem child?" Aizawa sighed, dropping his bag onto the dining room table before collapsing on the couch behind him. Fuyu and Luna, Aizawa had taken off that stupid Miss Fluffernugget collar before he left, were on either side of Midoriya, keeping a careful eye on the boy. He noticed that they had grown quite attached to the ghost. Well, Fuyu had. Luna still tried to claw his eyes out most of the time. "In the movies, you always see ghosts moving stuff around," he said as a way of explanation. His fingers traced the air around the pencil, but he never actually attempted to touch it again. "You know, picture frames, furniture, the whole stacking chairs on the dining room table thing dash. Don't do that. And I wanted to see if I concentrated hard enough, if I could touch things." Midoriya continued on as if Aizawa hadn't spoken at all. He hadn't even looked up since Aizawa returned home, too focused on what was right in front of him to be bothered by anything else. "It's not like anyone gave me the rundown of what to do after I died, and there are no materials I can study because of the skepticism surrounding ghosts and their existence. There aren't even any other ghosts around that I can ask, or if there are, I can't find them. The probability of me being the only one is very low, impossible even, but I haven't seen any trace of any other since I died. All I can use as a reference are movies and stories, but they can't all be reliable or realistic. So I just have to figure it all out on my own. It would require more time than I'm comfortable using, but if it's possible, I should try. Aizawa listened intently, despite how the boy's ramblings quieted towards the end into soft mutters. It was as though Midoriya had forgotten that he was actually talking to someone other than himself. He wondered if it was due to the lack of communication with others since his death, or if this behavior had been around for a lot longer than that. Whatever the case, the kid seemed to be accustomed to bearing the burden on his own. He would have offered to help the boy find answers, but Aizawa knew that he was useless in this situation. He may have been a teacher, but he wasn't trained to teach kids how to navigate the afterlife. Have you ever thought that maybe you just aren't looking in the right places? Aizawa challenged, crossing his arms over his chest. Midoriya shifted his head the slightest fraction but gave no other outward response to show that he was listening. Aizawa may not have been able to give him the answers he was searching for, but he might be able to give him a direction to go in. Have you considered that some ghosts are blending in with ordinary people? That the reason you can't find them is because you're looking for the obvious when they could look like everyone else? Aizawa watched the back of his head as the boy remained oddly quiet. No words were spoken for a handful of minutes as Midoriya silently processed his words. The underground hero thought that he was mulling over them, but in all actuality, something else was raging within Midoriya's skull. Something that Aizawa would never be able to understand because he was still alive. He still had a future ahead of him. Midoriya completely shifted forward, the way he was before Aizawa returned home. His attention returned to the pencil resting on the table. Or perhaps they just don't realize that they're dead yet, Midoriya suggested softly, reaching out for the pencil once more. Aizawa knew that something was wrong. He noticed the subtle change in Midoriya. The way his tone dropped a little lower than usual, the avoidance of eye contact, everything was pointing in the same direction. There was a heaviness in the atmosphere between them that hadn't been there moments before. "What's the problem, kid?" he asked as Luna swiped her claws across Midoriya's face, only to have her paw pass through his body like mist. "Hey, Mr. Aizawa," he began, finally turning around to face the pro-hero behind him. His expression was indifferent, but his eyes were another story. They were bright with curiosity, a youthful thirst for knowledge that probably got the boy into a lot of trouble. Are you scared of dying?" For a moment, Aizawa completely blanked. That was not where he thought the boy was going, and he had been caught off guard by his bluntness. It wasn't as though the question had popped out of nowhere. They were literally talking about ghosts beforehand, but that didn't stop Aizawa from feeling like he was treading into dangerous waters. "I'm an underground hero. Death is always a risk that I face every time I go outside, and I've come to terms that I may die any day," Aizawa explained carefully, his eyes meeting Midoriya's. The boy only gazed up at him, as though his answer meant more than it actually did. "So, no, I'm not scared of death. It comes with the job description." A knowing smile plastered itself onto Midoriya's face, the scar on his cheek stretching. The curiosity dissipated from his eyes, and for a moment Aizawa thought he saw a flicker of sadness growing within his irises. He could have been mistaken though. "I agree, death isn't terrifying, but I think dying is." Midoriya offered no explanation as to why he believed the way he did. He simply turned his back on Aizawa to refocus his attention on the pencil. The simplicity of Izuku Midoriya's words were easy to understand, but the weight they carried would stay with Aizawa for a good while. The next morning, Aizawa had told Midoriya that he was taking his class on a field trip to the USJ to do some rescue training. Midoriya had waved at him, a silent goodbye. Aizawa had been expecting to return home that night, probably to the sight of Luna ripping away at Midoriya's intangible form. Unfortunately for Shoyuta Aizawa, he didn't make it home that night. It all started when a purple mist engulfed the lower level of the USJ, his students noticing it before him as he had his back turned towards the rest of the facility. A small army began to pour from the portals, filling the UA facility with actual villains. Leading them all was a man clad in all black with multiple, dismembered hands attached to his body. Aizawa didn't recognize him, but his senses were telling him that he was extremely dangerous and they should proceed with caution. 13. Evacuate the students immediately, he ordered the pro-hero beside him as he unwrapped the capture scarf from around his neck. His plan had originally been to hold off the villains while the students evacuated to avoid being hurt. Aizawa knew that his skills weren't meant for head-on battles, but he could stall them until backup showed up. With his erasure quirk, he could spare a couple of minutes, but it all depended on his students and 13 being able to call for help. The villains had jammed their signals, leaving them unable to warn the rest of the UA staff. A portal villain had divided his students amongst all parts of the USJ, separating them. That same villain, Kurojiri was his name, was blocking the only exit. There was no escape. There was no help. 13 was out of commission. His students were scattered. Aizawa knew a hopeless situation when he saw one, and right now, he was neck-deep in it. He just prayed that his students were faring a little better than him. Their leader, the one with the hand fetish, rushed towards him, his pale hand outstretched. Aizawa managed to dodge the first few attacks while trying to deal with the rest of his minions, but eventually, the man caught up to him. When the villain grabbed his elbow, his entire body exploded with pain. He felt his skin and parts of his muscle disintegrating. Aizawa hissed in pain, kicking away from the man before erasing his quirk. He had been using hit-and-run tactics for a while now, and his eyes were getting dry. He couldn't keep this up much longer. More of his lackeys appeared, but Aizawa threw them around with his capture scarf, avoiding any major damage to his body. He fought to catch his breath, his eyes locked on their leader, Shigaraki. It was a mistake to be focused on only one target. "I'm not the final boss," Shigaraki growled, his red eyes almost glowing from beneath the hand that he used as a mask. Aizawa could almost see the smirk growing on the villain's face. A large shadow fell over the underground hero. When Aizawa turned, he saw an enormous beast with navy blue skin with the head of a bird, minus the feathers. Its beady, ebony eyes were dull, unintelligent, but they were thirsty for blood. The monster's brain was poking out from its head, lightly pulsing as the thing looked down at him. It was in that moment that Midoriya's words came back to him. "Are you scared of dying?" Aizawa barely had time to cry out before the beast grabbed his head, smashing it into the concrete. His goggles were ripped from his face, the metal splintering as they clattered to the ground. He felt the blood trickling down his face as his vision was dyed crimson, only to be blinded with white as the monster snapped both of his arms like twigs. He may have screamed, he couldn't remember. It was only some time after the beast crushed his head into the ground a few more times that he blacked out. Death isn't terrifying, but I think dying is. Izuku wasn't scared. He wasn't scared when the news channel that Aizawa had turned on for him before he left for school erupted with images of the USJ drowning in chaos. He wasn't scared when they announced that the USJ had been attacked by a group calling themselves the League of Villains. He wasn't scared when they said that there had only been 3 major injuries, and they were only to the pro-heroes on scene. He wasn't scared when Yamada left a voice message on the home phone to tell him that Aizawa had been seriously hurt. No, Izuku wasn't scared at all. Izuku had been afraid before, but what he was feeling now was not fear. It was something else, something a little more twisted and cold and empty than fear. It was like a deathly calm had settled over him, one that blanketed the raging emotions that seemed so willing to burst forward. He tried to reach his hand out, to touch the emotions lingering below the surface, but they only sunk further down to a place he didn't think he could come back from. They had done so countless times before, but something felt different about this time. He had the feeling that they wouldn't come back so easily this time around. Slowly, as though he was in some sort of trance, Izuku made his way to the UA infirmary where Aizawa was being treated by Recovery Girl. If it had been any other time, under some other circumstances, Izuku might have been excited to be within the gates of the #1 hero school in the whole nation of Japan. He would have taken in the scenery, gawking in amazement at the sheer size of the intimidating school. He would have before, but things were complicated now. Izuku somehow managed to hunt down the infirmary, but it took many wasted minutes of poking his head into a dozen walls to find it. Aizawa was lying on a bed, covered head to toe in bandages like some sort of mummy. Both of his arms were wrapped in thick casts. Izuku couldn't see the extent of the damage through the bandages, but they spoke for themselves. The villains had mercilessly crushed Eraserhead. Even his eyes were wrapped in the white cloth. Izuku wondered if that meant that his quirk would be impaired. "Hey, Aizawa?" Izuku cocked his head, searching for any sign of a reaction, but it would appear that the underground hero was unconscious. "Is your answer still the same now?" It was sort of unfair of him to ask such an important question when the one who would answer wasn't able to. "One of Aizawa's students? But he's not even wearing a uniform," an unfamiliar voice echoed from behind Izuku. "How'd a little pipsqueak like you even get in the infirmary?" Izuku didn't think he'd overwhirled around so fast in his life. It couldn't have been that another person was able to see him. Why were people that were suddenly able to see and hear him popping up out of nowhere? It was just his luck that he was seen after breaking into the UA campus immediately after a villain attack. How was he going to explain this? Standing a few feet away from him, with their arms crossed against their chest, was a woman he had never seen before. She was dressed like a pro-hero in a black, skin-tight, sleeveless suit with a white cape hanging from her shoulders and a red skirt clipped around her waist. Her dark hair was pinned in a half-up and half-down style that vaguely reminded him of his mother. She was obviously older than Izuku, probably closer to Aizawa in age than himself. Her eyes bore into his as Izuku's jaw dropped. She looked like a hero, but he had never seen her face before. When his eyes met hers in a blinding panic, she looked slightly taken aback. "Huh," she breathed, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Huh, huh." The woman nearly screamed, backing away with wide eyes. "You can see me?" Izuku blanched, his jaw hanging open as he pointed at himself. I think I should be asking that question," he whispered, examining the woman head to toe. She didn't seem any different from any other person he'd see on the streets. Sure, she had the appearance of a hero, but she looked completely ordinary, alive. The woman seemed to be doing the same, looking him over as though he was some sort of alien that popped out of someone's chest. The growing horror on her face calmed Izuku a bit. If she was dead like he thought she was, to see another ghost in front of you, one that was half your age, was probably a terrifying feat. She must have come to the same conclusion that he did in that moment. There were 2 dead people in Yue's infirmary. "I'm Izuku Midoriya," he stated, meeting the woman's eyes once more. Nana Shimura. As a former pro-hero, Nana Shimura knew that not everyone could be saved. There would always be people that the heroes couldn't get to in time. It was the unfortunate, frustrating fine print that came with being a hero, one that all new heroes seemed to skim over in the beginning. No one ever wanted to believe that people still died early in a world brimming with heroes and extraordinary powers, but sometimes the unimaginable happens. Sometimes, heroes weren't enough to save everyone. Nana knew this fact. She's known it for years, but with the rising of the symbol of peace, there seemed to be a steady decline of those cruel events. She had failed to rescue people during her time as a hero. She recalled all the times she had been forced to bear witness to the horrific aftermath of countless battles and tragedies. She had seen their mangled bodies amongst the rubble and bore witness to their families shattering once they heard the news. Nana was only given the statistics of her failures after the raging storm ended. She wasn't brave enough to look into the details of those she failed to protect. She never learned their names or engraved their faces into her mind, but she was well aware that just because she didn't know them, it didn't make their deaths any less real. As she sat across from the green-haired teenager, she had that same pit of fear and dread collecting in her stomach like she used to get each time the police informed her of those casualties. Nana had died fairly young, barely 30 years old, but the boy in front of her was easily half her age. He didn't even look like he had entered high school yet, but his body was doused in ragged scar tissue that marred his skin, and there was a weight on his shoulders that didn't belong to a mere child. He was only a teenager, and he had died. No one had been able to save him. Nana had to wonder whether the boy was one who had died during a villain attack or if he was someone who no one knew needed saving. "So I'm the first ghost you've seen since?" Nana let her voice trail off, more for her sake than Izuku's. She wasn't ignorant enough to believe that children never died, but that particular truth was easier to swallow when she wasn't looking directly at the ghost of a teenage boy. Izuku scratched the scars stretching along his cheek, a thoughtful spark igniting in his eyes. At the very least, you're the first one I've interacted with, he murmured, his brow furrowing a fraction. A sigh escaped his lips as he leaned back onto his hands from where he was sitting. I guess Aizawa was actually right. Ghosts really do blend into society. The former pro-hero bit the inside of her cheek, her lips pursing in confusion. Something resembling disappointment had flooded the boy's tone, almost like a kid who had lost a bet. How do you know Aizawa if you weren't one of his students? She questioned gently, as though she was overstepping somehow. I'm haunting his apartment. Nana blinked slowly, not quite comprehending his blunt words. Is there a reason for you to do that? The boy hummed softly to himself, contemplatively. I mean, he moved into my old apartment, and I had nothing better to do with my time, he mused, his eyes tracing careful circles in the ceiling. Though, now that I think about it, it's more like I'm inhabiting his apartment with his permission rather than simply haunting him. You're saying that he knows you're there? She asked, her hands clenching into fists across her chest. Izuku nodded, hesitantly. I'm not sure how yet, but there are a few living people that can still see me, he admitted, his gaze finally returning to meet Nana's. I've only met 3 so far, including Aizawa, but they can talk to me. It almost sounded like something from a movie, like it was too good to be true. For decades, Nana had been dead, and never once had she been able to communicate with anyone. She had been alone, only able to watch over those she once cared for while they slowly moved on without her. She had been overjoyed to see her successor grow and learn and become the symbol of peace. He had defeated their greatest enemy, barely escaping with his life, but she had never been prouder of Toshinori. He had succeeded where she had only failed. But she was never able to convey how content she was to see him grow into the man he was today because he couldn't hear her. Nana tried every single day for weeks, but soon she realized that it was futile. She convinced herself that it had stopped bothering her a while ago. Even if she couldn't tell him herself, she would always stick around in the shadows and support him. Toshinori would just never know. Miss Shimura? Are you all right? She absent-mindedly nodded, still lost in her thoughts. Of course, Pipsqueak, she reassured, shaking off the wanton envy burrowing in her chest, and you can call me Nana. No need for formalities now. Izuku nodded, seeming a little uncomfortable with the request. So, me Nana, what are you doing in UA? You weren't a teacher here, I would have heard of you if you had been. You look like a pro-hero, but I don't recognize you at all. Does that mean you weren't all that famous? Or perhaps you were a new hero rising? But there haven't been any recent hero deaths in Japan lately, which must mean that you died a while ago, he rambled, his voice growing softer as he stopped talking to Nana directly. It was as though all of his thoughts were slipping free from his mind and falling into his lap in unrestrained heaps of unintelligible words. Were you a hero when All Might was becoming a big shot in the hero community? Is that why I don't recognize you? Were you overshadowed by him? Or maybe you were a predecessor to him. Did you die before All Might became a hero? His head shot up as though she could possibly answer those questions that she didn't even understand. His brow was set in determination, his jaw locked as he awaited the answers she could give him. Nana chuckled, brushing her shoulder-length hair behind her ear. Slow down there, Pipsqueak, I didn't understand half of that, she said, raising her hands in a silent surrender. But yes, I was a hero before All Might's rise to power. In fact, I was his mentor during his early years. Though, that didn't last long. Izuku's expression turned solemn, his teeth ripping into his bottom lip, the curious sparkle fading from his eyes. I didn't know All Might had a mentor. She smiled grimly. I died rather early on, she explained, tapping her fingers against her thighs. It's no surprise that most don't know of my existence. He seemed to hesitate a moment, carefully filtering through his words before speaking once more. If you don't mind me asking, do you know how you became a ghost? He asked, his voice oddly quiet like a small child's after they were scolded for doing something naughty. Sorry, I don't think I can give you any answers, Nana stated, pulling herself back to her feet, stretching as though her muscles were sore from sitting for so long. I'm not quite sure myself of why I'm still hanging around. How about you? You have any idea? Izuku simply shook his head. I don't know either, he whispered, his lips pursing. Isn't it usually something like unfinished business? At least, according to all the ghost stories I've heard before, anyway. Of course Nana had heard of all the ghost nonsense before she died, but she had thought nothing of it. She hadn't actually believed in all that supernatural, horror movies crap until she had woken up upon the remains of the battlefield where she had fallen. Before then, it had all been just some childish stories intended to scare people, nothing more, nothing less. Nana never would have thought that she would actually become a part of those childish stories. I don't know what this unfinished business would be, Nana sighed, resting her hands on her hips as she gazed down at the boy. Sure, I was young, but I did what I needed to do. Izuku hummed to himself before grimacing. What if it had to do with the way we died? He wondered aloud, more to himself than to the former pro-hero standing before him. There has to be some sort of common denominator between us. It can't be all random. Her eyes narrowed. All right, she said. It was probably easier to go along with his idea than go against it. I died a fruitless death fighting against an enemy that had killed my predecessors. I had hoped that I could defeat him in order to spare Toshi all might the pain of fighting him, but I failed in the end. Though, he was able to defeat the villain in my stead many years later, so there's that. Izuku listened intently, soaking up every word like they were the most valuable thing in the world, but there was something off with the boy. There was none of that childlike curiosity or nervous energy thrumming out of him like earlier. Instead, an unnatural calm had settled over him as he analyzed the information he had been given. A maturity unbefitting of a teenage boy acted as a cloak that hid what should have been a child. Nana was having trouble seeing the boy beneath the dark glint gleaming in his eyes, one that shouldn't have belonged to someone so young and inexperienced. If someone had told her that everything she had seen before now had been merely an act, a ploy to get past her guard, she might have believed it. What about you? How did you kick the bucket? She asked, trying her hardest to ignore the way his eyes darkened when he realized that it was his turn. Izuku scratched the back of his neck, though his expression was completely blank. He seemed to be contemplating whether or not to tell her, but it didn't take long for him to speak. He told her the truth. Nana knew that not everyone could be saved, but God, she never thought that she'd have to look at one of the victims of negligence in the eye. Izuku tapped his foot nervously, a faint thrum of panic echoing through his chest. He had left Nana about an hour ago after discussing a few more things that might explain why they were still stuck in this place. The common denominator they had been searching for had been found, but it wasn't 100% yet. They hadn't discovered why some people could see Izuku, but they decided to save that discussion for another time. They possibly had an eternity to figure it out after all. After their conversation, he had rushed out to the lake where he and Todoroki had met previously. Of course, Izuku had heard that no students were seriously injured, but that didn't help the pit of dread curdling in his stomach. After seeing Aizawa, a pro-hero, in such a life-threatening condition, Izuku was genuinely terrified to see how the students were faring. Even if none of them were critically injured physically, the mental torture would probably leave lasting effects. Izuku had faith in Todoroki's abilities. He was strong enough to get into UA through recommendation, but this was an actual villain attack. They wouldn't have shown kids any mercy, and the students were inexperienced. Thank God All Might had arrived just in time to prevent any deaths. He just hoped that Todoroki would come by the lake today like they had planned the last time they saw each other. Izuku paced along the water's edge, running his hands furiously through his hair. Death was real, and it was certainly permanent. If Todoroki had died during the attack on the USJ, then he'd be gone forever. There would be no reversing the effects. He'd disappear. All the while Izuku would stay tethered here, alone with All Might's mentor. Obviously, Todoroki hadn't died. He probably wasn't even all that hurt, but it could have happened. The possibility that Izuku's newfound friend could have died circulated in his head like the annoying buzz of a fly that refused to leave him alone. The fact that Aizawa had nearly died as well, along with the Pro-Hero 13, had turned Izuku into a silent, trembling mess. He forced himself to seem calm, burying the panic down beneath a hopefully convincing facade. He wasn't sure how well it was working, but it was the only thing he could do to maintain this form. Otherwise, he'd morph back into what lied beneath the illusion of an ordinary boy, and that scared him more than he cared to admit. Seeing what was underneath the perfect picture of a normal boy meant that he'd have to admit that it was all false, that the ugly, bloodied boy beneath it all was what he truly was. Izuku shook off the thoughts terrorizing his mind, continuing his pacing. He didn't have time to be thinking about such dark things. He was waiting for his friend. His friend was coming to see him, and he'd be fine and uninjured. Everything would be okay. A stick snapped somewhere behind him, and Izuku swore that if he still had a heartbeat, it would have stopped right then and there. He whirled around to see a familiar head of evenly cut, red and white hair emerging from the tree line behind him. When Izuku's eyes met his gray and blue-eyed stare, he deflated with relief. Thank God, he breathed, the fear that had been eating away at him slowly dissipating as he rushed towards his friend. Are you all right, Todoroki? I heard what happened, it's all over the news. Are you hurt anywhere? Todoroki sighed, offering a small nod. I'm fine, Deku, he reassured, shoving his hands in his pockets. He was in his uniform, but Izuku could see the small cuts that sliced along his skin. It's just a few scratches, nothing to worry about. Yeah, but you were attacked by villains inside a school facility. Even if you weren't hurt, it must have been scary, Izuku protested, his eyes roaming over Todoroki in search of any injuries that he might have been hiding. The boy's gaze dropped down to the space separating them, a troubled glimmer flashing in his heterochromia eyes. They must be getting a lot of backlash, he murmured, his bangs falling forward to hide his eyes. Izuku pursed his lips. The media are swarming all over it, he answered, seriously. It's not every day this league of villains infiltrate the top hero school in the nation and nearly kill 2 pros. It's not looking good at the moment. Todoroki sighed heavily. The League of Villains brought a small army of small fry villains to take care of my classmates and I while the bigger players fought the teachers. They had this monster they brought with them, thinking it could defeat All Might, he said, his voice unbelievably tired. I think they called it a Nomu. Aizawa tried to protect us from it, but it defeated him. In that moment, he sounded so much like a scared child that Izuku felt something in his chest break for him. Izuku may have been dead, but he never had the misfortune of watching someone else being brutalized by villains, especially not someone he knew and saw every day. But Aizawa's class had seen their teacher beaten half to death. Izuku's first instinct was to wrap his arms around his friend despite knowing full well that Todoroki wouldn't be able to touch him. But Izuku didn't phase through Todoroki like he did when he embraced his mother. No, Todoroki was solid, warm. Deku? Todoroki breathed as Izuku's hands rested on his back. He could feel the smooth material of his uniform and the warmth radiating from his left side. Izuku squeezed a little tighter as though it was just his imagination, but nothing happened. He didn't slip through Todoroki's skin, even after he put his hands on Izuku's shoulders to push him away to look at his face. Izuku flinched away, staring at his hands as he stumbled back a few steps. They didn't look any different, but he had managed to actually touch Todoroki. He had never purposely tried to physically interact with someone else in a long, long time, but even then, just a few days ago, people were walking through him like he didn't exist. He was tangible again. What? Did you find a way to turn off your quirk? Todoroki inquired, trying to keep the shock from his voice, but he was just as unsuccessful as Izuku was hiding his. Izuku glanced up at the boy who was gazing back with slightly wider eyes than usual. When he had gone to hug him, he wasn't actually expecting to be successful in his attempt. Izuku shook his head slowly, still lost in his daze. This has never happened before, he admitted, his jaw clenching as he forced the tremble to disappear from his hands. Todoroki's brow furrowed, taking a few steps in his direction. Hesitantly, he put his hand on Izuku's shoulder. For the first time in a while, he felt like bursting into tears. He withheld the urge, but he couldn't help the small gasp that escaped his lips. I'm not an expert with quirks, but I don't think this usually happens, Todoroki said, giving his shoulder a gentle squeeze. Perhaps you've always been switching between intangibility and normal, but you've never been able to tell. Izuku nodded in agreement, but he knew differently. This wasn't normal. Something was happening to him, and he was scared of what would come next. Yeah, maybe you're right. Izuku didn't remember much about his father, besides what his mother had told him during those rare occasions when she felt reminiscent enough to recall the old days she had with Hisashi Midoriya. He had a childlike fascination with quirks, sometimes spending hours analyzing a single specimen. His mother told him that that's probably where Izuku got his obsession with quirks, but he secretly hated the idea that he had inherited anything from his father. He never admitted that little fact out loud to his mother though. That would hurt her, and Izuku didn't want to make his mother cry. He wasn't his father. The only peaceful memories that lingered in his mind of his father was the look of his mother's face when she spoke on the phone with him. A gentle sparkle resided in her eyes both Izuku and Inko shared, and a warm smile lit up her face. She looked so content, so gleeful that Izuku felt his teeth rotting in his mouth. How could she look so happy for a man who had broken her? Izuku would never know. He vaguely recalled a time when his father had returned home after a few months overseas. Izuku must have been 3 or 4 then. Hisashi had been sitting in his office, the door slightly ajar as the man scribbled furiously in a notebook before typing away on his computer. There was such an intense gleam in his black eyes as he worked that Izuku couldn't bring himself to look away. It was as though the entire world was resting on his shoulders, and if he failed, then he would be crushed. Izuku never had the courage to interrupt his father when he had that look on his face. He wasn't brave enough to, not after what happened the last time he distracted his father from his work. Aizawa reminded him a bit of his father in that respect. The recuperating underground hero sat at his dining room table, still wrapped in heavy, white bandages. Both of his arms were set in thick casts, and the same material encased most of his healing body, except for his eyes. It was only recently, but Recovery Girl had dubbed it safe for his eyes to be unwrapped, despite the permanent damage that had been afflicted to them. His face was perhaps the only part of his body that was healed enough to be seen. Aizawa was hunched over the table, gazing down at a few papers that lined the wooden surface. A hauntingly familiar, focused glare possessed his tired eyes. A sort of dark aura hung around him, and Izuku didn't think it had anything to do with how Aizawa was practically helpless without his arms. He wasn't paying attention to Izuku in the least bit, completely engrossed in the documents that were before him. The look in his eyes brought up unwanted memories that Izuku would prefer to stay forgotten. "Is there a reason why you're staring at me like that, problem child?" Aizawa suddenly asked, breaking Izuku out of his reverie. He sounded like he was annoyed, but he was too tired to scrounge for the will to be fully committed to that emotion. The boy quickly looked away as the underground hero turned his undivided attention towards him. Izuku tried to hide his scowl before Aizawa could notice, but it was far too late. The man was a teacher after all. He knew when something was troubling a kid. "What's wrong?" he sighed, a mask of indifference hovering in his tone, but Izuku could hear the small echoes of worry in his voice. For a handful of moments, he was met with deafening silence that only seemed to reiterate the wrongness of this situation. Izuku swallowed against the lump forming in his throat, keeping his eyes glued to the light trickling in from the window in the living room. There were 1,000 things that he had yet to tell Aizawa about himself, and Izuku would have gladly kept it that way, had the man not took the initiative to speak first. Despite the fact that they lived together in the same house, Izuku easily knew more about the teacher than Aizawa knew about him, but that was to be expected. Izuku valued his secrets, took them to the grave, literally. "You just reminded me of someone I used to know is all," he responded softly, wrapping his arms around his knees as he rested on Aizawa's sofa. The memories flooded back in, bringing with them old scars and wounds that he had tried his hardest to forget. "Why do I feel like that was an insult?" Aizawa muttered beneath his breath. Izuku hummed, slowly turning back so he could meet Aizawa's gaze from across the room. "I suppose it could be. He certainly wasn't a good person," he mused, his voice quiet as though if he spoke too loudly it would summon his father to his side. "That would definitely be the cherry on the top of this whole nightmare. I meant that you look like the rest of the world is depending on you to save it, and it would crumble into pieces if you failed." Aizawa huffed a loud breath. "I'm a teacher. I have 20 students depending on me and other heroes who trust me," he corrected, suddenly aging another 10 years within 2 seconds. It seemed like just the mere mention of his students exhausted the unfortunate hero. "If I failed them, the world might as well crumble." Izuku stared at him, his green eyes unblinking and oddly blank as he rested his cheek on his knees. Izuku wanted to warn Aizawa, to tell him that even if he would die one day, his little world would continue on without him. Eventually he, too, would be left behind, locked away in a pretty box 6 feet below their feet. It was inevitable, and the world was cruel. I wonder if I was wrong, Izuku breathed instead, tilting his head so his chin rested on his kneecaps. Maybe you aren't like him at all? Aizawa stared at the boy in a moment of tense silence. There was a heaviness in the atmosphere that hadn't existed a few minutes prior, one that the underground hero was all too familiar with. He often felt the same tenseness when dealing with victims of abuse during his job. It was a common occurrence, one that he hoped he never became used to. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, a wariness growing in his chest. Is that a good thing? The boy chuckled joylessly, slowly rising to his feet with a small grin plastered on his freckled face. Izuku wasn't sure why he was smiling. He wasn't happy. If anything, he felt like he was being ripped apart from the inside out by the cloud of pain that echoed throughout his body. Yet, for some reason that was far beyond his own comprehension, that crooked smile still forced its way onto his face. My father was a very intelligent man, Izuku stated, a strange jingle coating his voice. But if you were anything like him, your students would have died at the USJ, and that isn't an exaggeration. Aizawa blinked slowly, not an ounce of emotion crossing his face, not that Izuku could see anything beneath the bandages anyway. Do I even want to know what that means, problem child? He asked, a small sigh leaving his lips. Izuku shrugged. You care about your kids, which means that you won't ever let them down in the end, he said, his eyes drifting around the room anywhere but at Aizawa. You'd rather be smashed half to death by a Nomu than let them get hurt. That probably means more to them than you could ever imagine. Izuku hadn't been at the USJ during the time of the attack. He had been sitting right here, unable to do anything but listen as the news reporter announced what had occurred. When Yamada had left a voice message, Izuku had immediately rushed over, but there was nothing he could do but observe. Once again, the people around him were hurting, but he couldn't comfort them the way they needed. He was useless. You're one strange kid, you know that, right? A laugh burst from Izuku's lips, short but not fake. I get that a lot. Aizawa grumbled something incoherent that Izuku couldn't decipher. Izuku suppressed another dry chuckle before glancing at the clock hanging on the wall of the living room. It was almost time. He and Todoroki had been meeting as often as they were able to since the attack at the USJ. Whether if that was because they were growing closer as friends or if it calmed Izuku's nerves to see Todoroki alive and breathing, he wasn't so sure. Whatever the reason, the last few days were filled with hours sitting beneath a tree near the lakeside, talking to a certain boy about everything and nothing. I should get going, he murmured to himself, starting towards the door as though he was normal, as though he could actually use it. I'll be back later, Aizawa. Have fun with your paperwork. Aizawa grunted in response. Before Izuku phased through the door, he paused. His teeth gnawed at his bottom lip as he looked back over his shoulder at the man wrapped in bandages. Thank you for listening, Aizawa. There was a beat of silence. Get going, problem child, he grumbled, but there was no bite in his words or voice. Shudo rubbed the bruises forming on his stomach from training, letting out a hiss as he prodded a particularly tender one. Ever since the USJ incident a few days ago, his father had been hounding him more than ever about getting stronger. Especially since Endeavor suspected that All Might was growing weaker with each passing day. His father didn't even allow him to rest after being attacked by villains. Instead, Endeavor only criticized Yue's inability to defend against some villain wannabes. Every day, for hours at a time, he would force Shudo into the training room, and they'd fight until Shudo couldn't even stand anymore. A deep ache had settled in his muscles, making his movements stiff and painful. It didn't help that the bruises cried out at even the thought of moving, but Shudo had to meet Deku today. He had promised the boy he would be at the lake at 3. He wasn't one to break his promises. Deku was waiting for him by the lakeside like he always was when Shudo arrived. He had to wonder how long the boy was there, or if he always stayed in that spot, just as he had resided by the railing on that overpass for a month straight. No matter how early Shudo showed up, Deku always seemed to be there, waiting for his arrival with a bright smile that infected his green eyes with a matching glow. This time shouldn't have been any different, but it was. As Shudo approached him, Deku grinned, waving in a silent greeting, but Shudo knew something was wrong. He felt it in his gut. Though Deku was smiling, his eyes were carefully blank, dull. "Hey, Todoroki," Deku chirped with false cheerfulness dripping from his tone. Shudo couldn't help the faint worry that bloomed in his chest as Deku's mask of joy only strengthened as he lowered himself beside the boy with a small groan. For the first time in a while, Shudo could see the lingering darkness beneath his usual persona of nerves and blinding smiles. Despite the loud protest of his aching bones, Shudo turned towards Deku, keeping his expression neutral. "Deku," he began, wondering if it was all right for him to continue with his question, "Are you okay?" Deku's smile faltered for a moment as he cocked his head, the perfect picture of confusion. "I'm fine," he reassured quietly, his face softening as some light returned to his lifeless irises. "I should be the one asking you that, really. You're the one covered in bruises after all. They must be going all out with their training regimen for you to be so beat up." Shudo knew that Deku wasn't an idiot. In fact, he may have been one of the most observant people he'd ever known. He knew that Deku wasn't stupid enough to believe that all his wounds were from UA, but he played along with Shudo's story without complaint. Though, Shudo never missed the way that he scratched the back of his neck as he verbally brushed off the injuries as a result of Shudo's rigorous training he had to complete at school. He had learned that it was one of Deku's tells when he was lying. Shudo tried not to flinch away when Deku's freezing fingertips ghosted across a blossom of black and blue that had already formed on his jawline as a result of this morning's session with his father. Shudo succeeded, but Deku noticed the uncomfortable aura emanating from him and quickly yanked his hand away. Ever since Deku figured out that he could finally touch people, or at the very least Shudo, he had been taking his fill of human contact. Shudo couldn't exactly blame the boy. With his intangibility quirk, it must have deprived him of things that other, normal children would receive. If Deku hadn't been able to touch anything or anyone since his quirk manifested, he must have been so lonely growing up. Shudo swallowed the lump of regret forming in his throat, dropping his gaze to the grass between them. He paused, only for a moment, before coming to a final decision. These weren't from Yue. There was a tense moment of silence that permeated between the two boys, choking away what falsehood of happiness Deku had been wearing. A short, tight breath left Deku's lips as his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I know, Todoroki," he sighed, his voice sounding more gentle than Shudo had ever believed was possible from another human being. He twisted his body so he was facing Shudo directly, offering him his full, undivided attention. Shudo didn't think he could get through this if he looked into Deku's eyes, so he continued to glare holes through the ground. His hands clenched into fists, his muscles burning at the slightest bit of tension. "My father is Endeavor." His voice came out strangled as though by admitting it out loud was the worst sort of torture one could inflict upon him. He half expected Deku to cheer, to fanboy over the number 2 hero like he would All Might. It was no secret that Deku was a hero fanatic. He adored them so much that Shudo didn't doubt that he could have spent all day just talking about one specific hero. But Deku surprised him. He remained silent, waiting for his friend to continue. "He detests All Might more than anything. Which is what led him to force my mother into a quirk marriage so he could create the perfect children to surpass All Might. I was the 4th child, and because I could use both fire and ice, Endeavor deemed me a success. Since my quirks manifested when I was 4, my father forced me to train under him, tearing me away from my siblings. He never allowed me to associate myself with them. They were his failures after all. He would force me to fight him for hours at a time, only stopping when my mother intervened or I couldn't move anymore. Every day for years, I would be subjected to his punches and fire. I wasn't allowed to be a failure, and if he ever thought I was, he'd..." Shudo's voice trailed off, but he didn't need to finish for Deku to know what he was going to say. It was obvious in the way his body trembled and how his nails dug into his palms. Neither of them bothered to break the heavy silence that clung to them, not until Shudo had worked up the courage to continue. "He drove my mother insane." He huffed, his voice a little more composed than before, but not by much. He still felt fragile, like at any moment he would shatter into a million jagged shards. His hand rose unconsciously to his face, covering the scar encircling his left eye. She hated him so much that she couldn't stand looking at my left side anymore. She took a kettle of boiling water and poured it on my face. Then Endeavor sent her away to some mental hospital. I haven't seen her since. Shudo didn't register the pain of his fingers digging into his scar tissue until Deku gently grabbed his wrists, pulling them away from his face. Still, Shudo could not work up the courage to look his friend in the eye. Todoroki dash. I'm sorry for dumping this all on you when you aren't involved dash. Todoroki dash. I know you love heroes so you probably wouldn't understand dash. Suddenly Deku's hands released Shudo's wrists, instead, cupping his face as he forced him to meet his emerald gaze. The boy's expression was uncharacteristically blank, but Shudo noticed the small pinch between his brows. His voice froze in his throat, unable to say anything while caught in Deku's intense stare. A smile erupted across his face, one brighter and more genuine than Shudo had ever witnessed. It seemed almost unnatural given the situation they were in, but somehow it comforted Shudo's racing mind. Thank you for trusting me enough to tell me, he whispered softly, his hands freezing against Shudo's skin. Yet he didn't dare pull away, not when there was a knowing glimmer in Deku's eyes. I know how hard it is to admit something like this, especially when you don't think anyone will believe you. Shudo's lips parted in surprise as Deku's smile only seemed to grow. For the first time, Shudo was unable to read what may lie beneath it. Too blinded by the sheer innocence, he radiated as naturally as the sun did heat. He had to wonder if there really was no ulterior emotion behind that smile, or if this was the first time that Deku had really tried, to hide it. If so, Deku was successful. Why you believe me? Shudo gasped, stuttering as his eyes widened. Of course, Deku stated without hesitation. I trust you too. Shudo didn't know how tense he was until he felt himself relax. Besides, Deku continued, his hands falling away from Shudo's face as he sat back a ways, I have experience with fathers who pretend to be picture perfect. Despite the weight his words held, the implications, Deku's expression didn't change, not even a fraction. He couldn't help but look at the scars dusting Deku's skin in a new light. Shudo didn't want to imagine that it was his father that gave Deku those sort of wounds, but from what the boy was implying. Did your dad hurt you too? Deku frowned, his expression contemplative. His forearms rested on his thighs as his gaze rose to the sky, biting his lip in thought. Sometimes, he was never really around to hit me that much. He waited until my mom wasn't home to do anything, and then he would blame the bruises as me being a clumsy kid. I was too scared to tell my mom any different, so she never knew, he explained, his voice deathly calm as though he was talking about the weather or some TV show. His expression remained passive, and that scared Shudo more than if Deku had exploded with rage. He had never seen Deku angry, but Shudo had never seen him so aloof either. It especially got worse when I turned 4, and my doctor informed me that I was probably quirkless. Deku laughed, a bitter note hanging off each syllable. Man, he really didn't like the idea of having a useless son. He was pissed. Shudo shook his head in confusion. Quirkless? His eyes darted towards the water, his lips pursing. I was a late bloomer. The whole intangibility thing didn't start until 8 months ago now, he muttered, his fingers twitching as they hung over his knees. Shudo had never heard of late bloomers before when it came to quirks. He'd been told his entire life that there was only a small window after you turned 4 to see whether you'd have a quirk or not. Though, just because he had never heard of it before, didn't mean it wasn't real, and there was no way Deku could possibly be lying to him. Not that my father exactly stuck around to see much. It was shortly after I turned 4 that my father left, but for the first few years after, he'd return home occasionally. It wasn't long before his visits ceased completely, and all contact between us was severed. My mom always said that he was busy working overseas, but it wasn't hard to find out she was lying, Deku murmured, the breeze coming off the lake lightly rustling his green curls. Something dark flashed across his eyes, but Shudo just thought that in that moment, Deku looked horribly sad. She never figured out that I knew the truth about my father, or that he was an abusive jerk. I never had the guts to tell her, To shatter her illusion of a perfect family? Shudo tried to choke back the question that had been hovering on the tip of his tongue since Deku began telling him his story, but it was so difficult, especially when his friend looked like he should be crying. No tears glistened in his eyes, however. There was just something heartbroken about his expression that gave Shudo that feeling. "What was your father really doing?" he asked, against his better judgment. If it offended Deku in any way, the boy didn't let it show. Instead, he slowly turned back to face Shudo, the weakest smile that he had ever seen plastered on Deku's face. "My father's a villain." Silence. Shocked, never-ending silence. Deku grimaced. "You would be the first person I've ever told this to. I was never able to tell Kaken that I'm the son of a criminal." "Oh, Kaken is my childhood friend. Well, was, I suppose, but that's a whole other story. No one but my mother and I know who my father really is. Technically, I'm not really supposed to know either. My mom tried to hide it from me, but obviously, that didn't work out as planned. Now you know and I know, and this is all just one big mess because I'm rambling and I can't stop. Oh God, if Kaken was here he'd explode me into the sun if he heard Dash." "Deku, you're muttering again." He sighed, letting his head fall like a puppet cut from its strings. "I know," he mumbled, sounding as though he was resigned to whatever may come next. Shudo would be lying if he said he wasn't shocked. Shocked didn't even begin to cover it. He just learned that the boy before him, the one that possessed a childlike innocence and fascination, was the son of a villain. It was strange, and if Shudo thought too hard about it, he was sure his head would explode. Yet, despite how Deku was probably thinking he would react, Shudo didn't feel as though much had changed. He would be the first to know that children do not have to be like their parents. After all, that was something Shudo was trying to prove every day of his life. "Thank you too, Deku, for trusting me enough to tell me about your dad," he said, a small smile quirking at the corners of his lips. Deku blinked, his head shooting up. His eyes resembled a deer in headlights, but his expression quickly morphed into a gentle grin. "I guess we both have pretty crappy fathers, huh? I don't think that's supposed to be a good thing." "No, definitely not." Katsuki wasn't an idiot. He may have been young, only 4 years old, but he knew things even his parents didn't know. He doubted even Auntie Inko was aware of it either. It filled him with a strange sense of pride when he realized this fact, but it also set about an almost unwelcome wave of concern in the young boy. Why was he the only one who noticed that Deku's old man was bullying his son? Were all adults blind, or were they just plain stupid? How could they not see the way Deku acted whenever his old man returned home from overseas? Of course, Deku had always been a crybaby, so maybe it wasn't as obvious to people who knew how emotional that stupid broccoli wannabe was, but seriously? You had to be an idiot to not see anything was off. No one but him seemed to notice how whenever Deku's dad came back, Deku suddenly had dozens of bruises mottling his skin, more than what Katsuki remembered his friend getting from when they played together. Even if none of the adults could tell anything was wrong with Deku, shouldn't they have seen that creepy look Hisashi had in his eyes? Katsuki never liked the man. He always made him feel strange, like how he felt moments before the old hag scolded him. Katsuki didn't like liars, and he was sure that Deku's old man was the biggest one yet. He once asked his friend about it, but Deku would only shrug, saying that it was his fault. He interrupted his father while he was working. His father got angry. It was all Deku's fault. He wanted to tell Deku that that was the stupidest thing he'd ever heard, but something prevented him from saying so. It was just something in his friend's eyes that froze the words in his throat. Deku was a crybaby, but never once had Katsuki seen that expression on the boy. Katsuki never asked many questions after that. He was almost glad when his parents told him that Hisashi Midoriya wasn't coming home anymore. He knew Deku secretly was too. Katsuki wasn't sure why the memories of that time erupted so suddenly in his mind. It certainly wasn't the first time that stupid nerd had invaded his thoughts in the past 8 months, but it was definitely abnormal. Katsuki didn't want to remember Deku's piece of trash old man, certainly not now while he was still in class. He didn't want to waste his precious break time recalling anything about that bastard. He was almost thankful when his vision filled with familiar, spiky red hair and matching eyes. Almost. He was only tolerating Shitty Hair's presence because he was the only one in all of Class 1A that Katsuki could handle. That and Shitty Hair wasn't entirely useless. He had proved that during the USJ incident when they fought side by side against the villains. "Hey Baku bro," Kirishima greeted, a stupid grin illuminating his face as he approached Katsuki's desk. He really detested that nickname, but he would let it slide for now. Katsuki sked in response, but the moron in front of him didn't even seem to acknowledge the violent aura permeating from around the blonde. That or Kirishima was too much of a dense airhead to notice it in the first place. Either answer worked in Katsuki's favor. "What do you want, Shitty Hair?" he growled, crossing his arms over his chest. Kirishima pouted, patting the crimson spikes that he called hair. "My hair's not shitty," he mumbled, the same response he gave each time Katsuki called him that. There was no hurt in his voice. Kirishima wasn't so sensitive that a few petty insults could bring him down. "Anyway, the Baku squad and I dash. The what? We're planning on hanging out after school if you were interested," he finished, completely ignoring Katsuki's interruption as though it never happened. Small explosions sparked in his hands as his eyebrow twitched in annoyance. "Why would I want to hang out with you shitty extras?" Katsuki huffed, glaring up at his classmate with no real force behind it. "I have better things to do." Kirishima cocked his head like a confused puppy. "Come on Baku bro, it'll be so fun." Katsuki audibly cracked his knuckles, a quiet warning that if he continued to annoy him, he'd start blowing things to pieces. "I told you, moron, I have plans already," he hissed, leaning back in his chair. The redhead's lips tugged into a thoughtful frown, his eyes genuinely curious. "Really? What sort of plans?" Images of a woman with painfully familiar green hair infiltrated Katsuki's mind. He remembered a time when her smile was so inhumanly bright, a time when her only son mirrored that smile with such accuracy that it terrified him sometimes. The last time he saw the woman, she had not been smiling, not the way she used to. It was weak, pathetic even, but she tried. He shook off the waves of pain before they could touch him. "An old family friend is visiting," he muttered, looking away to avoid seeing the shock igniting on Kirishima's face. "You have friends outside of UA?" Ashido, probably a member of this Baku squad that Kirishima mentioned earlier, gasped, her yellow and black eyes widening in mock surprise. "What are they like? Are they cute? Did you hang out a lot?" Suddenly, it seemed as though the whole room was looking in his direction, not that Katsuki particularly cared about the whole lot of extras. He glared at the pink-skinned girl, a side effect of her acid quirk, explosions popping from his palms as he raised them threateningly. "Of course I have friends," Katsuki growled, sounding more like a feral animal than a 16-year-old boy. Ashido clapped excitedly, a maniacal grin tilting her lips upward. "And it's none of your goddamn business." "Ah, come on, Bakugo. Just one friend. Please?" Ashido begged, leaning over his desk with her hands firmly planted on top. She was practically jumping up and down, buzzing with glee. It was almost too much for Katsuki to bear. If Kirishima hadn't pulled her away, Katsuki was sure he would have blown her into tiny, pink pieces. "We never get to hear anything about you from before UA. So just tell us about one friend, and we'll leave you alone about it. Promise." She held out her pinky, but Katsuki just batted it away. He sighed heavily, not wanting to give in, but the promise of them leaving him alone was far too good to pass up. "Fine," he breathed, "but just one." Ashido cheered and Kirishima seemed to share her excitement, just at a much subtler level. Kaminari and Shiro, two other idiots that hung around Katsuki a lot more than he would have preferred, came up to his desk, interested to hear whatever he had to say. Katsuki was well aware that most of the class was listening in too. As he gazed up at the ceiling, a dozen faces flickered through his mind from his middle and elementary school days. He mostly maintained the same friends throughout his entire life, until now, his first year of high school. Some moved away or went to a different middle school. Others had a fallout and Katsuki never saw or heard from them again. But there was one person that kept coming back to his mind, over and over again. Of course, it was that stupid Deku. He had always been around, always smiling, always cheering him on. No matter how many times Katsuki tried to scare him away, he would eventually return to his side once again. Until Katsuki pushed him away, and Deku never came back. I had a childhood friend, our moms knew each other from high school or whatever, so it was only natural that they would force us to be friends from birth, Katsuki explained, his fingers tapping against his desk impatiently. He really didn't want to talk about Deku, not after everything that's happened, but he thought that maybe telling someone about the green-haired boy would alleviate the guilt settling in his chest. And who knows? Maybe if more people knew about Izuku Midoriya, the childhood friend Katsuki knew, then Deku wouldn't have to disappear from his memory quite so soon. Kaminari raised an electric blonde eyebrow, a dopey smile painting his lips as he leaned his elbow on Siro's shoulder. Was this childhood friend anything like you? He snickered, placing one hand on his hip. Katsuki scoffed. Of course not, the damn nerd and I had nothing in common, he spat, remembering all the days they spent playing heroes and villains in their rooms. First of all, he was a total hero fanatic that had a knack for analysis. He literally had 13 notebooks dedicated to heroes and their quirks. It was freaking creepy sometimes how detailed they were. Was that part of his quirk? Mina questioned, her eyes glimmering as she leaned towards Katsuki. Analysis? Or perhaps superintelligence? It must have been pretty cool if you hung around him. Katsuki shook his head, recalling the expression his childhood friend wore when he told him the news. He hadn't been crying then, but he could remember the bags settling heavily beneath his eyes. Instead, at that time, Deku had been smiling as stiffly as a porcelain doll created to do so. Katsuki could only come to the conclusion that there were no longer any tears left to cry within the boy. He was quirkless. The entire class went silent at that. Quirkless? Ida, the class rep, repeated, his eyes narrowing behind his glasses. That's quite rare these days, almost unheard of. Katsuki scratched the back of his neck, releasing a low growl from his throat. Before he could cuss out Four Eyes, Kirishima spoke. What's his name? Katsuki stared at the red-headed boy, his brow furrowed in what might have been anger, or perhaps something else that he didn't have the patience to decipher. Could he actually say his name out loud? He hadn't dared to speak Deku's real name in a small eternity, finding that it upset his parents and Auntie Inko every time. So he kept silent. He huffed a quiet breath, mentally preparing himself in case anyone recognized his childhood friend's name. He seriously doubted anyone would. Deku's image had been broadcasted all over his local news for a week or so as the police investigation went on, but it quickly died out as more people grew bored of it. They forgot about someone who had been a constant in Katsuki's life so easily. Izuku Midoriya. His teacher's eyes rose from his desk as the name passed his lips, the underground hero nearly expressionless. Yet Katsuki could see the recognition fading in and out of Aizawa's dark gaze. For a moment, Katsuki wondered if Aizawa knew who Deku was, if he had heard the news stories. If he knew that Katsuki Bakugo was once friends with the same Izuku Midoriya who fucking jumped off his school's roof. It was a scary thought. Are you guys still friends? Shiro wondered aloud, his finger tapping his chin. Now that you go to separate high schools, it must be pretty hard to maintain a friendship. That wasn't the only reason why it was hard to have a friendship with Deku. It was difficult when the other person was buried under 6 feet of dirt, but Katsuki didn't say that out loud. That would be stupid of him. None of your damn business, soy sauce face. When Katsuki returned home that night, Inko Midoriya was already in the kitchen, talking to his mother. It had been a little over a month and a half since he last saw her. A month and a half since she moved out of the apartment, the same apartment where Deku had grown up in, but not long enough to leave it himself. Katsuki wholeheartedly understood her decision, but still wondered how she could leave behind every trace of her son so easily. He had been there to help pack his things into cardboard boxes. It had been years since he last entered that room under his own accord, but it was still full of All Might merch, just as he remembered. Or at least it had been. He had been the one to take the posters down from his walls, leaving behind stains from the years that had been up. He packed away all of the figurines and countless comics Deku had collected over his entire life. The last to go had been the 12th hero analysis for the future notebooks he kept on his shelf. The 13th one was missing, it wasn't in the fountain by his middle school anymore. Inko had told him that if he found anything he wanted, he could take it. Katsuki chose those 12 notebooks. It would have been a waste to let all of Deku's hard work be thrown out. But that had been the last time he saw Inko Midoriya before today. She turned when she heard the door shut behind him, offering him a bright smile that resembled the one she used to wear when her son was still around. Katsuki had to admit, she looked better than the last time he'd seen her, happier, or at the very least, not drowning as much in her grief. He still caught traces of it in the bags beneath her green eyes, but it wasn't as prominent as before. Maybe leaving that tiny apartment behind had been for the best. "Hello, Katsuki, it's good to see you," Inko said, her smile filling her voice with a soft warmth. Katsuki didn't return the smile, but he did attempt to soften his expression, even if it was only a fraction. "You too, Auntie," he mumbled, glancing over at his old man who was sitting in the living room, watching the news. He wanted to avoid all the mushy stuff for as long as he was able to, so he sat on his sofa beside his dad, staring at the images flashing across the television. The saddest thing about it all was that Katsuki was experienced enough to know when something was about to go wrong. Every time something seemed perfect, as if everything was right in his little corner of the world, life would throw him a curveball that destroyed that tempting illusion. When Deku promised to be his sidekick when they were little after they both manifested their quirks, Deku found out that he was quirkless, that he could never be a useful hero. That had been the first curveball. The second came in middle school. He was popular, strong, better than everyone in that entire school. He was accomplishing great things. He had the top grades, the best quirk, everything he could ever ask for. Then someone he had known for his entire life was suddenly and permanently gone, and Katsuki was left with more questions than answers. By the age of 15, he attended the funeral of someone he had grown up with, someone he knew every secret of. Or so he thought, judging from what the police said. And now Inko was finally getting back on her feet after the tragic death of her son. She seemed to be taking the first step in moving on, and she was already showing some minor improvements. Katsuki didn't want anything to stand in the way of that. But this. What the actual hell? This would ruin everything. Aizawa wasn't surprised to see Midoriya sitting in the living room, his eyes glued to the local news on his TV when he got home later that night. What surprised him was how Luna, or Miss Fluffernugget as Midoriya adamantly called her, was nestling into his side, his scarred fingers trailing along her fur absent-mindedly. What surprised him more was recalling what he overheard in class today. "I didn't know you knew Katsuki Bakugo," Aizawa stated as a way of greeting. He set his bag on his dining room table before walking into his room to quickly change into some more casual clothing. "Katsuki Bakugo?" he heard Midoriya repeat as Aizawa pulled a black, long-sleeved t-shirt over his head, confusion leaking into his tone. A gasp of realization echoed down the hallway, through the crack of his bedroom door. "Oh, you mean Kaken?" "Yeah, we grew up together." Aizawa pushed his bedroom door open with his foot, now fully dressed, as he pulled his long hair back into a low bun, walking back to the living room. Midoriya had torn his eyes away from the news to look at the underground hero, a curious expression consuming his face. "You call my ultimate problem child Kaken?" The boy furrowed his brow, a small pout quirking at his lips. "What's wrong with Kaken? You call Yamada a lot of weird things. Especially on Weekend Dash." "I am not getting into this conversation with you, problem child," Aizawa grumbled, quick to interrupt the boy before he heard something that would forever scar his ears. He slid onto the couch beside him, crossing his bandaged arms over his chest. "Bakugo just brought you up in class, and I was curious about your relationship, nothing more, nothing less." Midoriya cocked his head, the playful glint fading from his expression. "Maybe I'd rather talk about you and your boyfriend's relationship than Kaken's and mine," he quipped, scratching Luna behind the ears, her purring increasing tenfold. "Hisashi isn't my boyfriend," Aizawa sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. He could already tell that this was going to be a long, exhausting night. Too bad he had work tomorrow. "That's what they all say. What would you know about it? You're like 10. The problem child's head snapped back to the underground hero, an annoyed edge taking over his demeanor. "I'm 15. You certainly don't look it." Midoriya guffawed, his jaw nearly dropping to the floor. Was that a short joke? I swear if that was a short joke, Aizawa, I will go full poltergeist on this apartment and give Miss Fluffernugget to Todoroki. Aizawa sat up a little straighter, his dry eyes widening. Todoroki? As in Shuto Todoroki? He asked, watching as Midoriya avoided his gaze with a stubborn determination only teenagers possessed. Since when were you two friends? That's the part you're worried about? Izuku questioned, his eyebrows raising. I have lots of friends. You, Yamada, Kaken, Todoroki, Nana Shimura, yeah. That's a little creepy now that I think about it. The underground hero shook his head as though to clear it because there was no way he was hearing any of this correctly. Nana Shimura? Who the hell dash? Before he could finish, his phone chimed with a text message from inside his bag on top of the dining room table. Izuku suddenly seemed very interested in petting Luna. We're not done with this conversation, Midoriya. Oh, so you're okay with talking about my friends with me, but you won't talk about your secret relationship with Yamada? Aizawa had the sudden urge to rip all of his hair out, or perhaps strangle the boy with his capture scarf. Though, he doubted the second option would work out well for him. Izuku Midoriya was a bit more slippery than he appeared to be. Instead, he stood up from the couch, looking over his shoulder at the ghost. They are two completely different things. Whatever you say, Dad. Aizawa nearly stumbled on his way to the dining room table, followed immediately by a small burst of laughter coming from Midoriya. The simple three-letter word had nearly given him a heart attack at the age of 30, and Aizawa was sure it would have definitely killed him, had he not had another matter to attend to. He pulled his cell phone out from one of the dozens of pockets in his bag, seeing that it was a text from his hero agency warning him about a new villain on the streets. Apparently, this particular villain had vanished from society for several years, and only reappeared back in Japan in the past week or so. The message said that he would be briefed more on the criminal at a later date. Midoriya, have you heard anything about a returning villain in Japan recently? Aizawa called out from where he stood by the table, his back still turned away from the boy. He knew that Midoriya was oddly talented at analysis, especially when it came to quirks and people, and he watched the news for hours every day. He especially paid attention to anything revolving heroes and villains. If anyone had heard anything, it would most likely be Midoriya. For some reason, though, Aizawa mostly asked to warn the boy. There was really no reason to, he knew that, but it was probably just his inner teacher ordering him around. He received no response from Midoriya. Hey, problem child, he called out once more, this time turning to face the boy as he spoke. Midoriya was now standing, Luna currently crawling beneath the couch in a hurried fashion as though something had terrified her. His green eyes were unbelievably wide as his arms fell limply at his sides. There was a certain stillness to him that Aizawa had never noticed until that moment. It was as though he had frozen in time, his entire body as stiff as solid glass. He was staring at the TV screen, a haunted look dawning on his face. Aizawa followed his gaze to see a man, maybe in his early 40s, maybe late 30s, with pitch-black hair and dark, soulless eyes. His skin was tanned, a mess of freckles cascading down his cheeks. He wore a crazed grin, promising violence and death to anyone who crossed him. There was a strange familiarity to the man, but Aizawa couldn't quite put his finger on it. Below the picture, the name Dragon labeled the man. So that was the new villain, back once again. Since his return, he had already caused one major massacre in a city not too far from here. He had killed a group of quirkless teenagers, burning their bodies until they were beyond immediate recognition. What's wrong? Midoriya? The boy was uncharacteristically quiet, his body silently trembling in fear. Midoriya? Evidence from police investigations lead them to believe that the villain, Dragon, is heavily associated with the newly found League of Villains that attacked UA's campus not too long ago, the news reporter stated, her voice appropriately grim. It would appear that the League of Villains are recruiting many powerful allies as of late, but police urge citizens not to panic. The heroes and investigators have everything under control. Midoriya shook his head slowly, choking on a disbelieving laugh. That would be my real dad. Aizawa glanced between the boy and the image of Dragon on the TV screen, beginning to see the physical similarities. They both shared that same light dusting of freckles and scars, but Midoriya's skin was a few shades lighter than his father's. The boy's scars were larger, more jagged. But that's just about where their similarities ended. Dragon's eyes were emotionless, cold. Darkness hung onto his smirk as though he wanted to rip the world apart piece by piece, and he would enjoy every miserable second of it. He possessed the same malicious glint in his dark eyes that Aizawa often saw in villains. Midoriya's eyes held a fragile, innocent spark that he clung to like some sort of lifeline. His smile was genuine and full of mischievous joy. Aizawa could see none of his father's personality in the boy. It would seem like your dad's back in town. Midoriya huffed a pained laugh, collapsing back on the couch, his head falling in his hands. He's joined up with the League of Villains and he's killing quirkless kids again, he scoffed, his fingers tangling in his hair. Surprise, I guess? Aizawa knelt in front of the boy, waiting for him to lift his head before speaking once more. Does anyone else know who your father is? Midoriya shrugged. My mom? The Bakugos probably know now or will soon. I told Todoroki, he whispered, gazing down at his hands with a conflicted expression. I never told Todoroki my real name anyway, so he probably shouldn't be able to connect the dots. But if he does, I doubt the news will let out Dragon's real name anyway. No harm, no foul. It'll be all right, Aizawa murmured, hesitantly lifting his hand to ruffle Midoriya's hair. It was still strange, learning that he could actually touch things now, even after he was already dead. Midoriya shook his head. It's not me I'm worried about, he muttered, before meeting Aizawa's eyes. Hey, if you ever see my father, can you punch him in the face for me? Aizawa allowed his lips to quirk up just a fraction. I'll probably do more than that, problem child,